The door was shaking the way cheap motel doors shake when someone on the other side has run out of patience. Room 7, Harborview Motor Inn, Coos Bay, Oregon. Past midnight in October, rain coming off the Pacific at a 40-degree angle, the kind of rain that treated umbrellas as a personal insult. The heating unit on the far wall clanked and shuddered and generated about half the warmth its dial suggested. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Maya Torres had been awake for 3 hours lying on top of the bedspread in her jacket because the blankets smelled like 100 strangers, counting ceiling tiles in the dark because counting was something to do that wasn't thinking. 14 across, 12 down, 168 tiles. Her daughter's voice came from under the covers. Lily was 7. She'd been in and out since 10, restless the way children get restless when their bodies register something their minds can't put a name to. She was holding Captain, the stuffed fox that had traveled with them from Portland to Salem to Eugene to Corvallis to here, losing one glass eye somewhere around Roseburg back in August. The remaining eye stared at the ceiling from its position against Lily's chest, one-eyed and patient. Mama, the door won't stop shaking. Maya was already moving. In the other bed, Dario lay on his side, watching. 10 years old. He'd stopped asking certain questions sometime in the last 2 months, the ones about when they'd have a kitchen again, whether his school records would transfer, whether the word homeless was the correct word for what they were. He'd learned to read his mother's posture instead, measuring from the set of her shoulders and the speed she moved whether things were approaching bad or had already arrived there. She crossed the room and pressed her palm flat against the hollow wood. Felt it. Low, sustained pressure. Not wind. Someone's knuckles, not quite knocking, just resting against the frame with a patience that was its own kind of threat. I know you're in there. A man's voice, the consonants blurred. Lady at the front desk, said room 7. Wrong room, Maya said. Silence. The pressure dropped from the door. Footsteps moved off down the covered walkway, unhurried, fading into the rain. She stood with her hand against the wood for a full minute after they were gone, not because she thought he'd come back, but because her legs needed a direction to send the weight they were carrying. Behind her, Lily's voice came thin and careful. Is he gone? He's gone, baby. Who was he? Nobody who matters. She went back to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress sagged. Dario's eyes were still open in the dark. She reached over and put her hand on his shoulder, and he let her, which meant he was more frightened than he was willing to show. Go to sleep. I wasn't scared. I know. Were you? She thought about the lie. About the particular lie parents assembled in the dark to protect their children from the real size of things. She decided on something in between. A little. Not much. He nodded, rolled back toward the wall. She sat and listened to his breathing slow over the next 10 minutes, the sound of a 10-year-old willing himself into sleep through sheer determination. Lily had already dropped off again, Captain pressed to her chest, her free hand curled near her mouth the way it always was when she finally went under. Maya looked at them both for a long time. $380. That was the number in her banking app, the one she'd stopped opening more than once a day because the frequency of checking hadn't changed the amount once. The motel was $49 a night. 7 more nights until the math ran out entirely. After that, there was the car, a 2009 Honda with 140,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on since March. She'd done the car before. 2 weeks in a parking lot behind a Safeway in Eugene in August. The kids in the back seat with sleeping bags, a camp stove on the tailgate. Lily still believing it was camping on day 11, which had been both a grace and its own kind of grief. The county shelter on Franklin Street had a 12-day wait. She'd called Monday. They were very sorry. She had the name of a family services coordinator named Patricia, who'd given her a list of resources that mostly linked to other lists of resources, and the number for a housing counselor in Portland she'd already called twice without getting a call back. Derek Torres had been gone 22 months. She knew the count without checking because certain dates don't live in the calendar so much as in the body, a weight in the chest that remains constant regardless of everything else happening around it. He hadn't died. She knew how to handle death, or at least she understood its shape. What Derek did was smaller and in some ways harder to grieve. A Tuesday afternoon in December. She'd been at school pickup. By the time she came home with the kids and the grocery bags and 3 bags of Lily's things from the after-school program, the master bedroom closet was exactly 2/3 full, the bathroom counter missing his razor and the 3 bottles he kept on the left side, and a handwritten note on the kitchen table that said, "I'm sorry this isn't working, and I think you know that too." She hadn't known that. Or she'd known it the way you know something you've committed to not looking at directly, the way you can sense something wrong in a house and attribute it to the neighbor's drains or the weather, because the alternative explanation requires you to stop and dismantle something you built your life around. She'd met Derek at 24 at a design conference in Portland. He was in marketing then, sharp and easy to be with, the kind of man who made the room feel like it had been arranged for him. They married at 27. Dario came at 28. Lily at 30. For a while, for several years that she could now identify as a specific and bounded period that had felt at the time like simply their life, things had been fine. Not perfect, never particularly calm, but held together by the ordinary mechanisms of 2 people who had made a commitment and were working it out in real time. The unraveling had been slow enough that she'd interpreted each individual stage of it as temporary. His increasing absence from the house, the way conversations would start normally and then simply stop, as though he'd concluded them internally and forgotten to tell her. The evenings she'd notice him looking at something on his phone with an expression she'd never seen him use before, and which he'd closed off the moment he registered her watching. She'd named each of these things something: manageable work stress, the pressures of the industry, just a hard season. She'd been thorough about the naming. The debt came in pieces over the next 6 weeks. Not his debt, technically. Their debt, because of joint accounts and a home equity line he'd opened 18 months before leaving, which she'd signed without reading as carefully as she should have, and 2 credit cards she hadn't known existed carrying balances that together exceeded her annual income. The house in Northeast Portland had never really been theirs. The mortgage was structured on the assumption of 2 incomes, and she'd been carrying it alone for almost 4 months before the letters shifted from overdue notices to documents with legal formatting and explicit timelines. She was a graphic designer. Freelance, mostly for small agencies and tech startups. Good money in good years, unsteady in lean ones. After Derek left, the lean years started. A major client folded in February. Another restructured in April and cut its contractor relationships. The freelance work she could still pull in barely covered groceries and minimum payments on the debt she hadn't known she was carrying. And then in May, Lily started pressing her hand to her left ear and saying it hurt. The diagnosis was cholesteatoma, an abnormal skin growth in the middle ear that, if untreated, would erode the ossicles, the 3 small bones responsible for transmitting sound, and cause permanent hearing loss. The surgeon was clear about it without being unkind. This required intervention. The procedure cost $14,200 after insurance, to be paid in 3 equal installments, and the follow-up medications ran another $300 at the pharmacy. Maya paid it. She would have paid it again. Lily's hearing was not a line item she was willing to negotiate. But the sum of everything together, the mortgage, the credit cards, the equity line, the medical debt, the 2 months of freelance payments that had simply never arrived, stacked up into a weight with no upward limit. She'd called the bank. She'd called the mortgage servicer. She'd called a nonprofit housing counselor named Robert, who was kind and methodical, and told her what the numbers actually meant, which was that the house was going into foreclosure and she had 60 days to find somewhere else. The night she told the kids, she made their favorite dinner. Tacos, because Dario loved them, and because Lily loved anything with cheese melted on top, which meant the tacos also had cheese melted on top. They sat at the kitchen table in the house they were about to leave, and Maya said they were going on an extended trip while she sorted some things out, and Dario had nodded in his careful way, and Lily had asked if Captain could come, and Maya had said yes, of course Captain comes. And that was the night she understood that children process catastrophe differently than adults, not by denying it, but by immediately locating the one thing they needed to bring along. 3 weeks at her sister Rachel's house in Beaverton. Rachel was genuinely warm. Her husband Greg was generous in a way that kept careful accounts, the kind of generosity that recorded every item in a private ledger and made its discomfort visible through small comments that were probably meant to sound casual. He mentioned property values once, in passing, at breakfast. He mentioned school district disruptions twice. He didn't say the thing he was building toward, which was that having his sister-in-law and 2 children in his den had an expiration date he hadn't announced but was absolutely counting down to. Maya left before he could reach it. She wrote a thank you note on the kitchen counter and drove south to Eugene, to a friend named Dominique who had a pull-out sofa and didn't ask questions. Dominique's place was small, and they were there 3 weeks as well. And then Dominique got a job in Seattle and the apartment was sublet, and that door closed. The car in August. 2 weeks. Maya called it camping. Dario stopped believing by day 3 and said nothing about it. Lily believed through day 11, which was longer than Maya had any right to expect. September, a motel in Salem with an extended stay rate. Then a cheaper one in Corvallis. She applied for design positions at agencies in Portland, Eugene, Sacramento. Most didn't respond. 2 called, and then went silent after the initial phone screen. One said they'd keep her resume on file, which was the professional language for no, and which she had heard often. Enough to translate without effort. By October, she'd moved to Coos Bay for no particular reason except that the Harborview motor inn had the cheapest weekly rate within range of her last working internet search, and because the ocean, irrationally, felt like something that couldn't be foreclosed upon. It didn't carry debt. It didn't ask about employment history. It just moved back and forth, whether you were watching or not. $380. 7 nights. The end of the list approaching. She'd been through the end of a list before. She knew what it looked like. You hit the bottom and either found something that wasn't written down anywhere, or you went back to the top and read different lists. The library opened at 9. She was on the steps at 8:47 with the kids in their coats, Lily holding Captain by one ear, Dario with his backpack, the 3 of them waiting in the kind of October morning that made the Oregon coast look like something painted on glass, fog still heavy, the light coming from everywhere and nowhere, the smell of salt and pine and low tide. The librarian unlocked the door without comment. Coos Bay was a working port city with a history of timber and commercial fishing, and its public library was the kind of institution that didn't make a production of people who arrived before opening time and needed somewhere warm to be. Maya set the kids up in the children's section. Dario had found a series about a boy who built robots from salvaged materials. Lily wanted anything with animals on the cover and had assembled a stack of 7. She placed Captain on the table beside her to monitor the selection process. Maya took a computer terminal at the back and opened the Notes app on her phone. She applied for 2 design jobs she'd already applied for, in case the first applications had slipped through without registering. She called the county shelter and confirmed the 12-day wait hadn't changed. She pulled up rental listings and did the conversion in her head, each listing's monthly rent divided by 30, then divided again into how many nights at $49 that represented, an exercise that consistently produced numbers she couldn't reach. Then, because she'd reached the end of the list again, she typed, Coos County Property Auctions. The page that loaded looked like it had last been updated in 2009, with Courier font and tables that didn't render correctly on modern browsers, and a footer noting Internet Explorer compatibility. 11 properties in the current tax lien auction. 10 were residential lots and commercial parcels with minimum bids between $1,400 and $22,000. The 11th was different. She read it twice. Property ID, CC, 1887, PTM. Point Morrow Lighthouse and Keeper's Cottage, Point Morrow Road, Coos County. 2 structures, Lighthouse Tower and attached Keeper's Cottage. Last assessed value, $3,200. Structure only, land assessed separately. Status, condemned, per county order dated 1987. Last registered owner, Edmund H. Hargrove. Tax delinquency from 1993. Minimum bid, $250. 00. Current bids, 0. $250. Nobody else bidding. She clicked through to the property history. Built 1887 by the federal government to mark a rocky shoal 400 yards offshore that had claimed 11 vessels in the previous 20 years. Operated under the U.S. Lighthouse Service until 1939, then the Coast Guard through 1962, when it was automated and the last keeper retired. In 1966, sold through a federal surplus program to Edmund H. Hargrove for $4,000 cash. Hargrove occupied the property intermittently until the late 1980s. The condemnation order from 1987 cited structural concerns with the tower and the cottage roof. After 1989, No record of Hargrove at the property or anywhere else in Coos County. Tax delinquency beginning 1993. The county had carried it for 30 years because the property had no obvious commercial value and no one had asked about it. The lighthouse was 87 feet tall. The keeper's cottage had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room, per a survey attached as a scanned document from 1961. 2 photographs, both black and white, both dated 1962. The tower from the cliff below, the lantern room dark. The cottage from the front, a man in Coast Guard uniform standing in the doorway, squinting against whatever sun was present that day. Maya looked at those photographs for a long time. The condemned status meant no bank would finance a purchase. That was fine, because banks had made their position on Maya Torres quite clear over the preceding months. Cash only. She had $380. The minimum bid was $250. She would have $130 left. She was sitting in a public library thinking about buying a lighthouse for $250. She called Rachel from the parking lot, pacing a small circuit near the bike rack, while Lily watched from the children's section window. I found something. A job. A property. A lighthouse, actually. Coast of Coos County. Tax auction. Minimum bid is $250. The pause on Rachel's end was long enough to have texture. A lighthouse. There's a keeper's cottage attached. 2 bedrooms. A condemned lighthouse. The condemnation order is from 1987. That's 37 years ago, Rachel. Structures can change substantially in Maya. Her sister's voice dropped into the register it went to when genuine alarm replaced reflexive skepticism. Listen to what you're saying out loud. You have 2 children. You have $300 and some dollars. You're considering spending most of it on a condemned building on a cliff that nobody has lived in since approximately 1989. In the background, Greg said something. Maya couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. Greg thinks, I can probably guess. Silence. Mom keeps saying the shelter on Burnside, Rachel said finally. I know what Mom keeps saying. Maya, I love you. What you're describing sounds like the decision a person makes when they've run out of better options and started mistaking a bad option for a sign. Maya stopped pacing. The October wind off the water moved through her hair. Down the block, a fishing vessel was heading out of the harbor, engine low and steady. She watched it for a moment. She thought about the shelter on Burnside. She thought about the intake forms and the case workers and the careful documentation of circumstances. She thought about Dario's face when he'd read the word homeless in a pamphlet at the Family Services office in Salem. The way he'd looked at her and then looked away, deciding not to ask. The shelter has a 12-day wait, she said. The lighthouse exists right now. For $250, Maya. There is a reason nobody is bidding on it. There's also a reason it's been sitting empty for 35 years and the county still can't unload it. Sometimes things are overlooked for reasons that have nothing to do with their actual value. Rachel was quiet for long enough that Maya could hear her deciding something. At least go look at it before you bid, she said finally. Please, just go see it first. The auction closes at 5 today. Another pause. Longer. Please be careful, Rachel said. Please just be careful. She got the address, loaded it into her phone's GPS, went back inside, and collected the kids. Short drive, she told them. Going to look at something. Lily asked if it was something good. Maya said she didn't know yet, which was the most honest answer she'd given anyone in weeks. The turnoff for Point Morrow Road was 11 miles north of Coos Bay, marked by a metal sign, so weathered you had to already know what it said to read it. The road dropped to a single lane of packed gravel after the first 100 yards, descending through shore pines and salt scrub, following the terrain as it sloped toward the headland. Maya drove slowly. Her Honda made a sound on the downgrade that she categorized as probably fine and moved on. They came around a bend in the trees and stopped. The lighthouse stood on a headland that pushed into the Pacific like an outstretched arm. 87 feet of stone, the whitewash long gone to gray from 3 decades of salt air and neglect. The lantern room at the top was dark, but the gallery glass looked intact from this distance. All the panes present, none obviously broken. The keeper's cottage was attached to the base of the tower on the landward side, a low structure with a pitched roof and 4 windows visible from where they'd stopped, 2 of them missing their glass, covered with plywood that had warped and pulled away at the corners over what looked like many years of trying. Behind the lighthouse, the ocean ran to the horizon without a break. The sky was pewter-colored and deep. Waves broke on the rocks below the cliff with a sound that came up through the car, even with the windows closed, a low, steady percussion that was less a sound than a feeling in the chest. Dario said nothing. He was studying the tower with an expression Maya knew, the one he used when he was deciding whether something was threatening or interesting. Lily said, "It's so tall." "It is," Maya said. "Does anyone live in it?" "Not right now. Could we?" Maya cut the engine. "Let's go see." The property gate was a cattle gate across the road, latched with a chain looped through the post. Not padlocked, just looped, the way you loop a chain when you want the gesture of closure without the commitment. Maya unlooped it, swung the gate open, drove through, swung it back. The gravel beyond showed tire tracks, so old and rained in they'd gone soft at the edges, the kind of compression that takes months to achieve. The cottage front door had a padlock on it that was the same rust orange as the gate hardware. When Maya pulled on it, it came away in her hand. The hasp had corroded through. She held the lock for a moment, then set it on the ground beside the door. Inside, the smell was salt air and old plaster and something underneath that might have been cedar once, might have been 50 years of fires in a hearth gradually absorbed into the walls. The floor was wide wood boards, gray with age, scarred in the particular way floors get scarred when people have lived on them for a long time. The ceiling was low. The windows that still had glass were fogged with salt haze. Maya stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly. The walls were intact. No holes she could see, no obvious rot at first examination. The fireplace was stone, the same stone as the tower, and the hearth had been swept at some point, recently enough that no debris had resettled into it. The kitchen was small and stripped. No appliances beyond a cast-iron stove that had predated both world wars by the look of it. A hand pump over a stone basin. Pantry shelves bare except for 3 sealed mason jars on the bottom shelf, their contents dark, their labels written in handwriting she couldn't read from the doorway. She checked the bedrooms. 2 of them, as the 1961 survey had promised. Small rooms with low ceilings and wooden floors. The first had a cot frame without a mattress. The second had an old wooden chest pushed against the far wall and a single iron hook on the back of the door, and that was all. The bathroom held a chemical toilet and a basin. Above the basin, a wood-framed mirror, spotted and dim with age. Maya looked into it and saw herself looking back, her face reddened from the walk across the headland, her eyes carrying the particular hollowness of someone who has been managing on insufficient sleep for several months. She found the kids when she came back through. Lily was crouched by the fireplace looking up the chimney, which was exactly the investigation Maya would have expected her to run. Dario was at the window, looking out at the tower. "Does it go all the way to the top?" he said, without turning. "All the way. Can we go up?" The door to the lighthouse tower was set into the side wall of the cottage, a heavy construction of iron-banded timber that Maya had noted on her first pass through. It had a different lock than the front door. A proper key lock, old, with a keyhole plate worn smooth from decades of use. She tried the handle. It didn't move. "Not yet," she said. "But maybe." She went back outside and stood on the headland with her hands in her pockets and looked at the water. The rocks below the cliff were dark and slick from the last wave's reach, and the swells came in long and even, breaking with that low percussion she'd heard from the car. The wind on the headland was steadier than in town, not aggressive, just constant, the kind of wind that commits to its direction and doesn't negotiate. $250. 2 bedrooms. A fireplace that looked functional. A roof she hadn't inspected, but which showed no visible holes from ground level. A water pump she hadn't yet tested. A tower she couldn't get into. She thought about what Rachel had said. About decisions that desperation disguised as plans. She thought about whether being out of better options was a reason not to make a choice or precisely the condition under which the choice had to be made. She drove back to Coos Bay. She stopped at a hardware store and bought 2 flashlights, a box of matches, and a pack of candles. $18.43. She stopped at the library. The computer terminal in the back was free. She pulled up the county auction page. Point Morrow Lighthouse, still 0 bids. She submitted her bid at 2:17 in the afternoon. $250, paid through the county's online portal, the transaction confirmed in under a minute. At 5:04 p.m., an email arrived. She had purchased, at auction, a condemned lighthouse and keeper's cottage on a headland above the Pacific Ocean in Coos County, Oregon. No competing bids. The property was hers. She sat in the library parking lot with the confirmation open on her phone and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite relief, and not confidence either. Something more like the sensation of having made the most questionable decision available to you and discovering that it sat differently in the body than all the careful, considered decisions that had brought you to the place where only questionable ones remained. She called her mother that evening from the motel, after the kids were asleep. "I bought a lighthouse." Silence from Medford. "Diane, I heard what you said. On the coast. Coos County. $250. There's a keeper's cottage with 2 bedrooms and a cast-iron stove that draws." Her mother's voice came back measured, feeling out the terrain. "Is it safe?" "I'm going to find out." "Maya, honey." A pause. "Your father used to say the most dangerous thing in the world was letting desperation wear the mask of a plan." Maya looked at the ceiling. 168 tiles. "I know he did. But he also said that sometimes the only way to stop falling is to grab something, even when you can't see what you're grabbing." She hadn't known her mother had held on to that. Her father, Ernesto, had died when Maya was 19, a stroke at 61, fast and complete. One of those deaths that gives you no time to prepare, because there's nothing about a Tuesday afternoon in the grocery store parking lot that announces itself as the last ordinary day. He'd been a man who fixed things, who brought tools to problems the way other people brought opinions, who believed every broken thing could be made useful again if you looked at it with the right patience. She missed him with the same fresh sharpness every time, which was less often than it used to be, and that reduction was its own particular loss. "I'm grabbing," Maya said. "I know you are." Her mother's voice dropped into softness. "Just pay attention to what's on the other end of the rope." They moved to the lighthouse the next morning. The specific mercy of having everything you own already in a car was that decisions executed without friction. No boxes, no utilities to transfer, no deposit to negotiate. Just Maya and the kids and the Honda with the ongoing check engine light, and 2 bags and a stuffed fox with one eye. The drive up the coast took 40 minutes. Lily sang something to Captain for the first 20 miles, a song that had no fixed lyrics and no particular tune. Just an ongoing report on what they were passing and how it looked. Dario read. Maya drove with the radio on low and the ocean appearing and disappearing through the trees on her left, and somewhere around the 9-mile mark, she realized that her chest had unclenched slightly, for the first time in longer than she could readily identify. When Point Morrow Road appeared on her left, and they came down through the trees, and the lighthouse came into view on the headland, Lily pressed her face to the window. There it is. As though they'd been looking for it for a long time. Dario glanced up from his book, assessed the tower for 3 seconds, went back to reading. Maya pulled in through the gate, their gate now, a fact her mind was still turning over, and parked in front of the cottage. They spent the first morning cleaning. Maya had stopped at a hardware store before leaving Coos Bay, spending $31 on a broom, a mop, a bucket, and a pack of cleaning rags. She swept the floors first, finding them sound beneath the dust, the boards warped in places, but solid, no soft spots that suggested rot going deeper. The walls were plaster over stone, and the plaster held. The kitchen ceiling had a long crack running diagonally across it, but hadn't moved in years, to judge by the way the crack's edges had dried and hardened. She tested the water pump. It worked. The water that came from it was orange for the first 40 seconds, then cleared. She let it run for 15 minutes. Filling the stone basin and draining it, again and again, until the water that came out was clean and cold and tasted like the deep rock it had traveled through. The cast-iron stove drew. She proved it with a sheet of newspaper and a match the paper lit, and the smoke moved straight up the flue without hesitation. She spent half an hour clearing ash and old debris from the firebox, then built a fire with driftwood she'd gathered from the path down the cliff. The kitchen was warm in 20 minutes. Dario helped without needing to be asked. This was one of his consistencies, resistant to direction, but observant enough about practical problems that he usually solved them before you'd finished formulating the request. He swept both bedrooms. He opened the wooden chest in the smaller bedroom and found a stack of old wool blankets inside, shook them out on the headland in the wind, brought them back when they'd aired, and made up sleeping arrangements in the warmer bedroom near the stove. Lily organized. She placed Captain on the windowsill in the main room, facing the ocean, and announced this was Captain's designated post. She labeled the kitchen with a piece of cardboard and orange crayon. Our kitchen, in her spelling, which included an extra N because she felt the word needed it. She put the sign above the stove with 2 pieces of tape. By early afternoon, the cottage was not comfortable in any way that a stranger would recognize. But it was warm. It was dry. It smelled of the wood fire and the salt air coming through the gaps in the window frames. And when Maya sat on the floor with her back against the stone fireplace and looked at her children working in the small kitchen, she felt the thing she'd felt in the parking lot the night before, that she had made the most questionable decision she was capable of making, and it had been the right one. That first night, she lay awake listening to the lighthouse. She hadn't expected it to have a sound. She'd expected the ocean, the ongoing percussion of waves against the cliff, which she'd already started to hear the way you hear a clock ticking in a room you've been in for an hour, which was to say that she'd stopped consciously registering it. But the lighthouse itself had sounds. The tower groaned in the wind, a low and structural sound, the sound of mass responding to pressure with something short of complaint. The lantern room, 87 feet above where she lay, produced a faint whistle when the wind came from the northwest at the right angle, not shrill, more like breath across the top of a bottle, resonant and intermittent. The cottage walls ticked as the temperature dropped. And beneath all of that, something she couldn't identify, a sound she kept almost locating and then losing when she turned her attention toward it. Not mechanical, not the building's structural response to wind or cold. Something more like the sound of space makes when it has held things for a long time in the dark, the sound of pressure that has nowhere to go. She thought she was imagining it. She was tired enough to imagine most things. In the morning, she asked Dario if he'd heard anything unusual in the night. He was quiet for a moment, eating the oatmeal she'd made on the camp stove. "The tower makes a sound," he said. "What kind of sound?" He thought about it. "Like it's remembering something." She looked at him. 10 years old, finishing his oatmeal, entirely serious. "Did it bother you?" "No," he said. "It's just old." Lily had slept through everything. Captain held tight, one sock on and one off, the way she always slept when she felt safe. Maya had watched her daughter's face in the early morning light for a long time, the complete absence of the tension that had lived there since August, the smooth, uncomplicated sleep of a child who had decided, in the way that children decided things without deliberating, that she was home. Then there was the tower. The door between the cottage and the lighthouse remained locked. She'd tried it twice that morning, once on the way through and once deliberately, pressing the handle and feeling the mechanism hold completely. The lock was old, the keyhole plate worn smooth, the iron housing corroded to a deep brown, but old didn't mean weak when the construction was as deliberate as this. Without the key, the door wasn't opening. Without tools she didn't have. She'd also looked at the tower from outside, from several angles. The gallery glass at the top appeared intact. All the panes present, as far as she could determine from ground level. The lighthouse had been automated in 1962, which meant the original Fresnel lens was likely still. She'd checked this at the library, looking up the lighthouse records. A fourth-order fixed lens, installed 1902. Those lenses, she'd read in an aside on a maritime preservation site, were worth considerable amounts to the right buyers. She told herself that wasn't important. She kept finding herself thinking about it. The fisherman arrived on the second day. She heard his truck before she saw it, a diesel pickup navigating the gravel road with the practiced patience of someone who knew every rut in it personally. It parked at the gate and a man climbed out. 70s, broad through the shoulders still, the residual mass of someone who had worked hard in open weather for 50 years. White hair, a yellow rain slicker worn with the ease of a second skin. He walked up to where Maya was working, splitting driftwood against a stump on the headland. "Saw smoke from the cottage chimney," he said. "Figured I should come see. We just moved in." He looked at the lighthouse tower, then at her, then at the kids behind her, Dario watching carefully, Lily waving Captain's paw at him in greeting. "Chester Monroe," he said. "I fish out of the Point Harbor. Known this lighthouse since I was that girl's age." "Maya Torres." He nodded. His gaze went back to the tower and stayed there for a moment, and something moved through his expression, not fear precisely, but the considered wariness of someone standing at a respectful distance from something they've thought about for a long time. "You know who owned it?" he asked. "Edmund Hargrove. From the property records." Chester was quiet, still watching the tower. When he spoke, his voice had the cadence of someone who had told this story before, mostly to himself. Hargrove came here in '66. Paid cash, they said. Didn't finance anything through any bank in the county. He settled in. Lived here off and on. You'd see him in town sometimes in the early years, getting supplies, nodding to people, not unfriendly, but not interested in being known either. Had his groceries delivered from Coos Bay. After about 85, 86, he stopped coming to the harbor at all. And then one day in '89, he wasn't here anymore. Maya stopped splitting wood. Gone how? Chester shrugged, one slow roll of the shoulders. Nobody could say. His truck was still parked where it always sat. His clothes were still in the cottage. Whatever was in that lighthouse was still in the lighthouse. Just Hargrove himself was absent. He looked at her. The sheriff looked into it. Found nothing pointing anywhere. Filed a missing persons report. Eventually, after enough years had passed, he was legally declared dead. The taxes piled up because the county couldn't sell the place. Why couldn't they sell it? Chester held her gaze. People around here, he said, leaving the sentence where it was, which finished it better than any ending would have. He looked at her directly then, measuring, the way people measure when they're deciding how much to say to a stranger. You're planning to stay, he said. That's the idea. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. Down the cliff, a wave broke on the rocks with that low, resonant sound. There's something about this property you should know, he said finally. Maybe you already know. Maybe you don't care about it. You've got children, though, so I'm going to say it. He looked back at the tower. Hargrove was not a man who kept ordinary things in that lighthouse. He had materials brought out here in the first few years after he arrived: boxes, wooden crates, things on pallets that came in a truck from Coos Bay. I was young then, working the dock, and I saw the deliveries a few times. Heavy things. Things that took 2 men to carry. After about 1970, nothing going in or out. Whatever he put in there, he sealed in and left. Maya looked at the locked door visible through the cottage window. The county never went in to look. Couldn't find a key. Didn't want to pay a locksmith for a property they'd never be able to sell anyway. Chester paused. And I think, honestly, they didn't particularly want to know. He stood there a moment longer, turning something over. I'll tell you what I know about Hargrove, for what it's worth. He had money. Not the visible kind, no new truck. No big purchases anyone could point to. But the invisible kind, the kind where a man never seems worried about anything, never mentions the cost of things, never asks about prices. He had money the way people have money when they've had it long enough to stop noticing it. And when he came here, he came alone, which wasn't unusual for a man buying himself a remote property. But he also came without any history anyone could trace. No family who came to visit. No mail that anyone recalled. No name in any directory. He existed on this headland, and then he stopped existing, and nobody could explain either half of that. He looked at the tower one more time, and then back at her, and whatever decision he'd been making while he talked appeared to have resolved. That stove will heat the cottage through winter if you keep it fed, he said. Gather wood from the cliff path. There's always plenty after a storm comes through. He turned and began walking back toward his truck, unhurried, his boots on the gravel the only sound besides the wind. At the gate he stopped. If you need anything, he said, the harbor is 5 miles south. Then he climbed into the truck and drove back up the road, and Maya stood on the headland watching the dust settle after him, and listened to the ocean, and thought about what he'd said. Whatever Hargrove put in there. She went inside. The kids were at the kitchen table. Dario was working through a math workbook she'd bought at a grocery store 2 weeks earlier, before they'd found a school to enroll in. Lily was drawing with her crayons a lighthouse, recognizable to someone who knew what they were looking at, with a large sun above it and 3 figures standing in the doorway. She'd labeled the figures Maya, Dario, Lily in her distinctive backward-in handwriting. Maya sat across from them and looked at Lily's drawing for a moment. Who was that man? Dario asked, not looking up from his workbook. A fisherman. He knew this place when he was young. Did he say anything interesting? Maya looked at the door in the sidewall, the iron-banded timber, the rusted keyhole plate. He said the person who used to own it left some things behind. Dario looked up. In the lighthouse? Most likely. What kind of things? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Chester's voice and the specific care he'd taken with his words, the way he'd said ordinary things with the same weight he might have used for the opposite. "That's what I'm going to find out," she said. She found the trapdoor to the basement that evening, after the children were asleep. She'd noticed it that first morning, a square cut into the kitchen floor, fitted with an iron ring handle, and she'd registered it and moved on because there had been enough to take in without adding another space to the inventory. But Chester's words had been working in her mind all day, and after the fire died to coals and the cottage went quiet, she took the better of the two flashlights, pulled on her jacket, and crouched over the iron ring. The trapdoor was heavy. It opened on hinges that groaned with the first movement in years, and the smell that came up was stone and cold earth, and something faintly mineral, the smell of rock that had never been warmed by sunlight. She went down. The basement was low enough that she had to keep her head slightly ducked, a single room with walls of the same stone as the tower and cottage above. Cut and fitted stone, the way they built in 1887 when they expected the work to outlast the builders. The floor was stone, two cut blocks set close together, the mortar between them old and crumbled in places where the freeze-thaw cycle had worked at it over 130 years. A wooden shelf ran along one wall, empty. An old coal scuttle, a length of heavy iron chain coiled in the corner. Nothing alarming. Nothing that explained Chester's careful tone. She was about to go back up when her flashlight beam crossed the center of the room. She stopped. The stones of the floor were mostly uniform, the same cut blocks, the same old mortar in the gaps. But in the center of the room, 7 stones were arranged differently, larger than the surrounding blocks, fitted together in an octagonal pattern, 8-sided, deliberate, the seams between them running in a specific geometric order. And the mortar holding those 7 stones was different from everything else in the room. Not old, gray and smooth, and set at some point in the last 40 or 50 years, a different material entirely from the original construction, Portland cement where everything else was lime mortar. Maya crouched and brought the flashlight close. She ran her fingertip along the seam between the center stone and the one beside it. The gap was hairline thin, but it was there, a seam around the entire perimeter of the center stone, too regular and too clean to be a settling crack. She pressed the flat of her palm against it. Cold. All the stones were cold, but this one had something else in the way it sat against her hand, a slight give, a resistance that was different from the surrounding floor, as though the stone above it and the stone below it weren't the same thing. She stayed in that position for a long time, her knees on the stone floor, one hand against the center block, the flashlight in her other hand. The basement around her absolutely still except for the ocean, which she could feel through the stone rather than hear, a low vibration that had been working at this cliff for 130 years and had not yet finished. She thought about Edmund Hargrove, a man with the invisible kind of money, a man who had come here alone, without history, and had boxes of heavy things carried in by 2 men, and had sealed something in a lighthouse tower and something below a cottage floor, and had then vanished from his truck and his clothes and his tax obligations and the world. She thought about what kind of man did those things. What kind of man chose a condemned lighthouse on a remote headland for the work he had to do? What kind of man spent 20 years living above whatever he'd put below, and then one day in 1989 was simply not there anymore? She pressed her fingertip along the seam of the center stone one more time, feeling the hairline gap, the clean edge, the mortar that didn't belong to 1887. She ran the flashlight around the perimeter of the octagon. 7 stones in the pattern. The 7th one, slightly larger than the others, at the far edge nearest the lighthouse tower. She had not noticed before that the far wall of the basement, the wall that shared its face with the base of the lighthouse, had a section of newer mortar in it as well. Not octagonal, just a section, roughly rectangular, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, the cement gray and smooth against the surrounding stonework. An opening, sealed. Between the cottage basement and the base of the lighthouse tower, someone had built a wall and then bricked it shut. Maya stood up slowly. The candle flame she'd brought down with her bent sideways in a draft. She couldn't locate a breath of cold air from somewhere that shouldn't have been producing a draft, that had no visible source. She turned, moving the flame back and forth, watching where the air was moving. It was coming from the sealed section of wall. Whatever he had sealed away and then lived above for 20 years, and then walked away from one day in 1989 without his truck, without his clothes, without any explanation that had ever satisfied anyone. Whatever was beneath the keeper's cottage of the Point Morrow lighthouse, mortared over in Portland cement at some point in the mid-20th century by a man who had paid cash for a condemned lighthouse and then vanished. The candle flame she'd brought down with her bent sideways in a draft she couldn't locate. Maya Torres had bought this property for $250. She had $107 left. She had 2 children sleeping upstairs. She had a working stove and a water pump and a roof and a locked tower door and a sealed floor in her basement, and she had just discovered a sealed wall between the cottage basement and the base of the lighthouse, through which a draft was moving from a space that shouldn't have had any air to move. She held the candle near the sealed wall for a long time. The flame bent toward it steadily, not flickering, just leaning the lean of something drawn to a source, pulled by a consistent pressure. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, air was moving. Air moved when there was space for it to move through, and space meant volume. And volume meant something was in there that was not solid stone all the way down. She climbed back through the trapdoor, lowered it behind her, stood in the kitchen with the fire burned to coals and the lighthouse tower on the other side of the locked door, and the sealed floor 3 feet below her boots, and the sealed wall connecting the two, and the draft from a direction that had no explanation. She blew out the candle. She stood in the dark for a long time. Outside, the waves worked at the rocks below the cliff with their patient, indifferent rhythm. The wind pressed against the cottage walls. 87 feet of stone rose into the October dark above her, and whatever Edmund Hargrove had put inside it in 1966 and sealed away and lived above for 20 years and then disappeared from in 1989 was still there, had always been there, was breathing cold air through a mortared wall in the basement of a lighthouse that a broke, homeless single mother had bought for $250 at a county tax auction because nobody else had bid. Maya Torres did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid. Because some questions, once you've put your hand on them, won't let you put them back down. She went back down before the kids woke up. That was the first thing she did on the 3rd morning at Point Morrow, pulled on her boots in the dark, took the better flashlight, and lifted the trapdoor in the kitchen floor while the fire was still coals and the cottage was still quiet and Lily and Dario were still asleep in the bedroom with the chest at the wall. She went down the wooden ladder and stood in the basement and brought the flashlight across the room to the section of newer mortar on the far wall. It was still there. Of course it was still there. She had not dreamed it. In the daylight coming down through the trapdoor, the sealed section looked different than it had by flashlight alone. More deliberate. The rectangular patch was roughly 2 feet wide by 3 feet tall, its center about 4 feet up from the basement floor, roughly the height of a doorway bottom if you removed the threshold and filled in the space, which was what had been done here. The mortar was Portland cement, smooth, gray, applied with care. Not a hasty patch job. Someone had taken time with this. The edges were clean and the surface was featureless. No cracks, no bulge, no sign of whatever pressure might exist on the other side. The draft was still there too, faint and steady, moving through the sealed wall from some space beyond that had temperature and volume, and air that was moving rather than sitting still. Maya pressed her palm against the center of the patch. Cold. Colder than the surrounding stone. Colder than the floor. The kind of cold that came from deeper than the wall's thickness, from a space that hadn't seen heat in a very long time. She stood there in the early gray light from the trapdoor and thought about what she was going to do about this. There were things she knew and things she didn't know. She knew the lighthouse was hers, bought legally, the deed in her name filed with Coos County. She knew the tower was part of the property. She knew that whatever was inside the lighthouse had been there since before she arrived, placed by a man who had been legally declared dead, owned by no living person, with no estate and no heirs that any record could identify. She knew she needed a cold chisel and a hammer. She climbed back up, made the fire, made oatmeal, and waited for the kids to wake. Dario came into the kitchen first, as he always did, standing in the doorway with the slightly off-focus look of someone whose brain engaged before his eyes caught up. "You were up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He came to the table and sat. "The wall in the basement," he said, after a moment. She looked at him. "I saw the mortar when you showed me around," he said. "It's different from the rest. Newer. There's something on the other side of it." She studied her son for a moment. 10 years old, assessing the structural composition of a basement wall on the 2nd day of occupation. "How do you know there's something on the other side?" "Because if there wasn't, you wouldn't have gone down before breakfast." She set his oatmeal in front of him. I need to borrow some tools from Chester. Dario picked up his spoon. I figured. She drove to the harbor that morning with the kids in the car. The harbor at Point Morrow was 5 small boats and a dock and a fuel pump and a bait shack with a hand-lettered sign that said Chester's in red paint above the door. Chester was on the dock mending a net when she pulled up, working with the systematic patience of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped noticing the repetition. He looked up when she approached. Read her face. You went into the basement, he said. There's a sealed section of wall on the far side. Newer mortar, different cement. From the original construction. There's a draft coming through it. Chester was quiet for a moment, his hands still in the net. A draft from inside the wall. From inside the lighthouse base. The wall is between the basement and the bottom of the tower. He said nothing. He looked out at the water for a count of 10, and then at her. What do you need? A cold chisel. A 3-pound hammer. Anything else that would take out mortar without destroying the surrounding stone. He stood, set the net on the dock. Come to the shed. The shed behind the bait shack held a lifetime of tools organized with the specific logic of a man who had never lost a thing he needed. Chester found the chisel in 30 seconds, a heavy-handled one with a wide blade worn smooth from years of use. He found a 4-pound club hammer on the shelf above it. He handed them over without theater. The town, he said, while she was loading the tools into the back of the car, has been talking about that lighthouse for 35 years. You know that. I know. Once you open that wall, whatever's in there becomes known. He paused. Known things are harder to control than unknown ones. She looked at him. Are you telling me not to? Chester looked at the tools in her hand. I'm telling you to think about what comes after you know. Before you open something, it helps to think through what you're going to do once it's open and you can't put it back. She thought about the motel room in Coos Bay, about the ceiling tiles, about the draft moving through the sealed wall from a space that had been cold and dark and unvisited since before she was born. I've been thinking about it since 2 in the morning, she said. He almost smiled. All right then. She drove back up Point Morrow Road with the tools and her children, and she parked at the gate, and she went inside, and she lifted the trapdoor, and she went down into the basement with the chisel and the hammer and the flashlight propped against the shelf to give her the most light, and she put the chisel tip against the lower edge of the mortared section, and she hit it. The sound the hammer made in that low stone room was enormous. She hadn't prepared for it. The first strike rang through the basement, and up through the floor, and probably through every wall in the cottage. And above her, she heard Lily make a sound and Dario say something quiet and the scrape of a chair. She hit it again. And again. The Portland cement was not soft, but it was not stone either, and the cold chisel bit in on the 3rd strike and held. She worked the blade along the lower edge, feeling the mortar crack and separate, feeling the chisel find the line between the patch and the original stonework. The old lime mortar of the original wall crumbled where she touched it, but the Portland cement patch resisted in the particular way of something that had been put there with the intention of resisting. Dario appeared at the top of the ladder. Can I help? She looked up at him. Thought about sending him away. Thought about the 2 weeks in the car in August and the way he'd taken the camp stove apart and put it back together correctly without being shown, just by looking at it. Come hold the flashlight. He came down. He held the light where she needed it without her having to tell him. Lily appeared at the trapdoor, captain in hand, peering down. What are you doing? She asked. Opening a wall, Maya said. Why? To see what's on the other side. Lily considered this. Is something on the other side? That's what I'm finding out. Lily sat on the edge of the trapdoor and watched, captain positioned beside her to watch also. Maya worked for 40 minutes. The mortar came away in pieces, first small chips, then larger sections as she found the rhythm of it chisel at the joint, hammer on the chisel, the satisfying crack of cement releasing from stone. By the time she'd cleared the lower half of the patch, she could feel the draft more strongly. Not a suggestion of air movement anymore. A distinct, steady current, cold and mineral-smelling, coming from the other side. Dario said nothing. He held the light and watched and didn't ask questions, which was its own kind of helpfulness. The last section of mortar came away in a single piece, roughly the size of a dinner plate, and landed on the basement floor with a sound like a dropped pot. And then there was a hole in the wall, roughly 18 inches by 2 feet, the exposed edges of the surrounding stone pale, and dry, where the cement had kept the weather out for 50-some years. Maya brought the flashlight to the hole and shone it through. The beam cut into darkness on the other side. She could see the stone floor continuing the same cut-block construction as the basement, but wider, extending further than the light reached. The base of the lighthouse tower, the interior of it at ground level, a space that the Architectural Survey from 1961 had listed as the lantern room machinery, housing, and service area, which was apparently not all it was. Along the far wall, which was the curved interior wall of the tower itself, she could see shelving. Wooden shelving, old, built against the stone, running in sections from floor to ceiling. And on the shelving, in the partial illumination of her flashlight reaching through an 18-inch hole in a wall, she could see things. Shapes she couldn't resolve from this angle and distance. Crates. Dark wood. Some of them small, the size of shoeboxes. Some of them larger, the size of milk crates. Stacked on the shelves, and in some cases on the floor, arranged with purpose, arranged by someone who had thought about how to fit as much as possible into the available space. She pulled back from the hole. Her mouth was dry. "What is it?" Dario asked. She looked at her son. The flashlight made the shadows sharp. "Boxes," she said. "A lot of boxes." "What kind?" She didn't answer that. She put the chisel back against the wall and went back to work. It took another 20 minutes to clear the hole to a size she could fit through, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, the removed mortar in a pile on the basement floor, the exposed stone edges pale and almost luminous in the light. She went through head first, the flashlight in her hand, one knee on the stone floor of the other side, then both, then standing. The space inside the lighthouse base was larger than she'd expected. The 1887 tower had a thick stone wall at its base nearly 4 feet wide, and the interior diameter at ground level was about 15 feet across. In a working lighthouse, this lower room would have held the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens, the weights that drove the mechanism, the oil storage for the lamp. The machinery had been removed when the lighthouse was automated by the Coast Guard in 1962, and the room had been left empty. Hargrove had not left it empty. The shelving ran around 3/4 of the curved interior wall, floor to ceiling, and the shelves were loaded. Wooden crates in several sizes, each one sealed nails. In some, the wood weathered to a dark gray. In others, smaller boxes with lids that fit flush, made with the precision of someone who had spent money on the joinery. Metal canisters with twist-off lids. In one section, a series of flat wooden cases that had the proportions of display boxes, the kind that held presentation items, spaced carefully on their own shelf with padding between them. Maya moved the flashlight across the shelves slowly, left to right, top to bottom, trying to take an inventory. She counted 23 wooden crates of the larger size, 14 of the smaller ones, 8 metal canisters, 11 of the flat display cases. And in the center of the room, on the floor, something she hadn't seen from the hole, a shape under a heavy canvas tarpaulin, roughly 4 feet by 3 feet, and rising about 2 feet from the floor, roped down with coils of old rope that had stiffened and darkened with decades of cold. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, and the flashlight swept the shelves, and the particular quality of the silence in that space was different from the silence in the cottage dinner, weighted, the silence of a place where a great deal of concentration had been deposited over a long time. Dario's head appeared in the hole in the wall. "What's in there?" "Come see," she said. He came through. He stood beside her, and she gave him the flashlight and let him sweep it around the room himself. Let him see what she'd seen. Let the inventory accumulate in his 10-year-old mind without her interpreting it for him. He was quiet for a full minute. "There's a lot of stuff," he said finally. "Yes." "What's in the boxes?" "I don't know yet." "Are we going to open them?" She looked at the shelves. At the 23 large crates, the 14 small ones, the flat display cases. She looked at the shape under the tarpaulin. She thought about Chester's words on the dock. Once you open something, you can't put it back. "Yes," she said, "but not all at once." She started with one of the smaller wooden boxes near the center of the middle shelf. It was about 18 inches long, 12 wide, 6 deep, with a fitted lid and joinery at the corners that had been done by someone who knew what they were doing. The wood was dark and faintly oily to the touch, the kind of conditioning that happened when a sealed container held a constant internal environment over a long period of time. She worked the lid with the cold chisel, prying gently, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. The lid resisted for a moment, the fit between box and lid still tight after all the years. and then it released with a soft pop of equalized pressure, and the smell that came out was faint and waxy and metallic, like the inside of an old jewelry box cleaned with oil. Inside, on a bed of what had once been velvet and was now a faded color between burgundy and brown, were coins. She picked one up. It was heavy for its size, heavier than any coin she'd handled before. Gold-colored, or actually gold, the weight of it telling her immediately. The size of a silver dollar. One face showed an eagle in profile, the other an image she couldn't make out clearly in the flashlight. She tilted it. The date stamp, on the edge of the eagle face, read 1933. She didn't know what that meant yet. She didn't know the significance of that year, that design, that particular combination. She only knew the weight of the coin in her palm, the specific, undeniable density of something with actual value, and the 14 other coins lying on the velvet beside it, all identical, and the 12 more small boxes on the same shelf. She lowered herself to sit on the stone floor and held the coin in both hands and looked at it under the flashlight for a long time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Dario crouched beside her. He looked at the coin in her hands. Is it real gold? I think so. How can you tell? She turned it over. The weight, mostly. Gold is heavier than it looks. She put it back on the velvet and replaced the lid carefully, as though the box were something that needed to be handled with patience. She looked at the next box on the shelf. The next one after that. The 14 small boxes on this one shelf. We're going to need some help, she said. She called Chester from the cottage that afternoon, while the kids were at the table with the workbooks she'd brought. She didn't describe what she'd found. She said she'd open the wall and would like him to come look, if he was willing. He said he'd come the next morning. That night, she didn't sleep again. She went back to the base of the tower 4 times before dawn through the hole in the wall, into the room with the shelves, and each time she opened one more box and looked at what was inside and put it back and went back upstairs and sat in the kitchen with the fire going and tried to organize what she was looking at into something she could think about clearly. In between her visits to the room, she sat at the kitchen table and listened to the lighthouse. The tower was quieter on this night. The wind had dropped after midnight, and the lantern room whistle was absent, and what she heard instead was the ocean and the ticking of the cooling stove and, once, the sound of Lily talking in her sleep about something Maya couldn't make out, a murmured conversation with whatever Lily's dreams contained. Box 2, more coins. Different design, a woman's profile, a wreath, the date 1907. Smaller than the first coins. Still heavy. Still gold. Box 3, paper. Old paper, folded, inside a sealed oilskin packet. A ledger, handwritten, the entries in a neat cursive that ran across the columns without spaces, each line recording a transaction, quantities, dates, and a code she couldn't decipher immediately, but which seemed to correspond to the boxes on the shelves. A catalog. Someone had kept a catalog of everything in this room. Box 4, coins again. This time silver, larger, the kind of large silver coins that preceded modern currency. American trade dollars. She counted them. 40 in the box. Box 5, small ingots. Not coins. Rectangular, roughly the size of a fat paperback book, with a stamp on one side that said United States Assay Office and a number and a weight in troy ounces, for 100-ounce fine gold. For 100 troy ounces per bar. She counted them. 6 in the box. She did the math, approximately, at whatever gold was worth per ounce. The number she got didn't seem right, so she did it again and got the same number. She stared at it. She went back upstairs and made coffee and sat with the fire. Between the 3rd and 4th visits, she fell briefly and completely asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, and woke 10 minutes later with her heart hammering from a dream she couldn't recall. Only it's feeling the feeling of holding something whose weight she wasn't sure her hands were equipped for. She drank the cold coffee and went back down. Then she opened the laptop she'd been keeping charged at the library, and she looked up. 1933 double eagle gold coin. What she read took several minutes to process. The 1933 double eagle was a coin struck by the United States Mint, but never officially circulated, recalled, and ordered melted down before distribution because President Roosevelt had taken the country off the gold standard. A handful had escaped into private hands before the recall was complete. For decades, owning one was technically illegal. A court case in 2001 had established that one specific coin could be sold at auction. It went for $7.59 million. In 2021, another collection of 10 legally recognized specimens had sold at Sotheby's for a total of $18.9 million. She had 15 in a single box on a single shelf. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she looked up. How many boxes are on those shelves? She hadn't counted precisely. She went back through the hole and counted. 23 large crates. 14 small boxes on this shelf alone, and there were 4 similar shelves. 8 metal canisters. 11 flat display cases. And the shape under the tarpaulin in the center of the room, which she hadn't touched yet. She came back up, sat at the table, wrote numbers on a piece of paper, crossed them out, wrote different numbers, crossed those out too. The problem with trying to estimate the value of something like this was that value had layers. She didn't know how to penetrate. The numismatic value of specific rare coins was not the same as the melt value of the gold they were made from, and neither was the same as the auction value of a collection, and the collection's value depended entirely on what was in it, and who knew it existed and how the sale was handled. She didn't know enough about any of these things to produce a number she could trust. She knew one thing: the number was large. Larger than anything she'd been in proximity to in her life. Larger than the foreclosure, larger than the medical bills, larger than the sum total of everything she'd lost in the 22 months since Derek had left a note on the kitchen table and walked out of the life she'd built around him. She wrote $250 on the paper, the amount she'd paid for this. She looked at it for a long time. Chester arrived the next morning at 8, his truck on the gravel, his yellow slicker bright against the gray October sky. Maya met him at the gate. She didn't say anything while she walked him to the cottage and through the kitchen and down the trapdoor ladder and across the basement floor to the hole in the wall. He ducked through. She followed with the flashlight. He stood in the room with the shelves and said nothing for a very long time. He moved the flashlight beam across the shelves slowly, the way she had on her first entry, left to right, top to bottom, the inventory accumulating. Then he looked at the tarpaulin in the center of the room. How many boxes have you opened? He said. 5. What did you find? She told him. The 1933 double eagles. The 1907 coins. The ingots with the assay office stamp. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Chester put one hand against the curved stone wall and stood there. Hargrove, he said. It wasn't a question. He cataloged it, she said. There's a ledger. Every box is recorded. How many boxes total? She told him the count. He looked at the shelves again. His hand was still on the wall. You need a lawyer, he said. Before you open anything else. Before you tell anyone else. A property lawyer, to establish that everything in this lighthouse belongs to you as the legal owner of the property. Before someone else establishes it differently. He turned and looked at her directly. Hargrove had no recorded heirs. No estate. Declared legally dead 1999. Everything on this property transferred with the title. I know that. The government may disagree about the coins. The 1933 double eagles, specifically the federal position on those coins, is complicated. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. You were up all night reading. Most of it. He almost smiled again. That almost smile was becoming familiar to her, a specific tightening around the eyes that stopped just short of the full expression, as if the man had rationed his smiles out carefully over decades and was nearly at the reserve. There's a property lawyer in North Bend, he said. Margaret Ito. She handled the sale of 3 fishing licenses last year in my neighbor's estate. She's sharp and she's discreet. I'll call her this morning if you want. I want, Maya said. They went back through the hole and up the ladder, and Chester made the call from the cottage kitchen while Maya stood at the window looking out at the tower. On the other side of those walls, on shelves that had stood in the dark since 1966, a dead man's collection waited in its careful wooden cases. The shape under the tarpaulin waited too. She hadn't touched it yet. She was saving it, the way you save the last piece of something you weren't ready to finish. Margaret Ito arrived that afternoon. She was 50, compact. With reading glasses, she kept on top of her head in a habit of writing things down before she responded to them that gave her the air of someone who believed in documentation above all else. She came alone. She looked at the hole in the basement wall without comment. She went through it and looked at the room and came back out and sat at the kitchen table and opened her notepad. Tell me exactly what you paid, when you paid it, how the transaction was processed, and where the deed currently is. Maya told her. She pulled up the email confirmation on her phone, the county transaction record, the photograph of the deed she'd taken on the day it arrived. Margaret wrote everything down. The lighthouse tower and all its contents fall within the property description in the deed, Margaret said, without inflection. The county assessor included the structure in the title. Everything within the structure transfers. The 1933 double eagles specifically, Maya said, are a complicated matter in terms of federal law. However, Margaret tapped her pen against the notepad. The coins have been in private hands, on private property, continuously since before the relevant federal orders. The legal precedent on this is not clean, but it is not entirely unfavorable either. There have been cases. She paused. I'll need to research the specifics. I'll also need an appraiser. She looked up. A specific kind of appraiser, a numismatist, someone who handles rare coins and precious metals. Not a general estate appraiser. Someone who can document, authenticate, and value what you have. How long will that take? To find the right person? A week. To complete the appraisal of what you've described? She glanced at the hole in the wall. Considerably longer. Maya nodded. One more thing, Margaret said. And I'm telling you this as your lawyer, not as a neighbor or a casual acquaintance. What's in that room is likely to attract attention the moment anyone outside this house knows it exists. Attention from people with lawyers of their own. Government attention, potentially. Attention from people who will claim connections to Hargrove that may or may not be documentable. The window between now and that attention becoming a problem is small, and we should use it. She looked at Maya over her reading glasses. Don't tell anyone else yet. Maya thought about Rachel, about her mother, about the conversation she would eventually have to have, and how it would go. All right, she said. Margaret left with her notes and a photograph of the deed, and a promise to have the appraiser's name within 48 hours. Chester walked her to her car and stood talking with her at the gate for several minutes before he came back inside. She's good, he said. She'll protect you. Maya was at the stove making coffee. Outside, the afternoon light had started its early October decline, the sky going from pewter to something darker, the first stars appearing over the water. I still haven't opened the thing in the middle of the room, she said. Chester sat at the table. The tarpaulin. Yes. He looked at his hands. Do you want company when you do? She thought about it. She thought about the fact that she'd been alone when she found the hole, alone when she went through it the first time, alone in the middle of the night opening boxes and doing math and sitting with what the numbers meant. There was a case for continuing alone, for keeping this thing between herself and her children until it was fully understood. But she also thought about Chester on the dock with the net, his careful words, his tools given without theater, his phone call to the lawyer made without being asked twice. She thought about the kind of person who watched a lighthouse for 30 years and left it alone. Yes, she said. Tomorrow morning. He nodded and stood and said good night and drove back down the road to the harbor. And Maya made dinner for the kids and sat at the table while they ate and answered their questions the way she'd been answering questions for 2 days honestly, but in pieces, not faster than the situation required. What did the lawyer say? Dario asked. She said everything in the lighthouse belongs to us. He was quiet for a moment. Because we bought the lighthouse. Because we bought the lighthouse. Lily looked up from her dinner. Even the boxes? Even the boxes. Lily considered this, turning it over with the particular seriousness she brought to things she was deciding how to feel about. Miss Shirley left Kenneth the house, she said. Maya looked at her daughter. This was a reference to a book Maya had read aloud to them in the car, months ago, somewhere in the months of moving. A story Lily had asked to hear twice. Sort of like that, Maya said. Except ours has treasure in it, Lily said. Dario looked at his sister, then at his mother. Maya picked up her fork. We don't know what it is yet, she said. Lily went back to her dinner. Captain thinks it's treasure, she said. Captain can tell. She lay awake again that night. Not anxious, not the tight, grinding wakefulness of the Harborview motor inn with its ceiling tiles and its shaking door. Something different. The wakefulness of a person sitting at the edge of something large, not afraid of the drop, just needing a moment before the step. She thought about Edmund Hargrove, who he was. She'd found the ledger in box 3 and spent an hour with it after the kids were asleep, working through the handwriting. The catalog was meticulous, each entry in the same neat cursive, recording what was in which box, dated, with notes she'd been only partially able to decode. But at the front of the ledger, before the catalog entries began, there were 2 pages of notes in a different hand, larger, more slanted, less careful. She'd read those pages 4 times. Hargrove had written them himself, she thought, by the difference in the pen pressure and the slight impatience in the letter forms. The notes were not a diary, not a confession, more like a record, the kind a man made when he wanted to ensure that the facts were available to someone, somewhere, even if that someone wasn't yet identifiable. His full name was Edmund James Hargrove, born 1918 in Philadelphia. He'd made money in the bond markets in the 1940s, significant money, the kind that compounded when you reinvested it correctly and didn't spend much. In the early 1950s, he'd begun converting his paper wealth into physical assets, gold, silver, rare coins, because he'd watched what happened in Germany in the 1930s when the currency collapsed, and he'd watched what happened in 1933 when the American government confiscated privately held gold, and he had concluded that no paper instrument was safe, that only things you could hold in your hands could not be made worthless by a signature. The notes were specific about his reasoning in a way that surprised her. He wasn't a paranoid man, or at least he didn't write like one. He wrote like a man who had studied history with attention and concluded that institutions were less permanent than the objects they claimed to secure, and that a person of sufficient foresight should make their own arrangements. He'd written, "Banks are promises. The gold is the thing itself. I have decided to keep the thing itself." He'd spent the 1950s acquiring. He was methodical about it. The ledger entries for the earliest boxes recorded purchases through dealers in New York and Chicago and London, each transaction documented, the price paid and the date, and the dealer's name recorded in the catalog. He'd been building towards something specific, the most comprehensive collection of rare American coins in private hands. Not because he planned to sell them, because he believed that a thing which was rare and beautiful and made of gold would outlast anything denominated in paper, and because collecting had given him a purpose after the death of his wife in 1954 that nothing else had managed to provide. By 1960, he had accumulated what the notes described only as a considerable collection of physical assets and had been searching for an appropriate location to secure them. He had specific requirements: remote, private land, structurally sound but not of obvious commercial value, at sufficient remove from any population center that routine traffic would not bring visitors. He'd looked at properties in Montana, in Alaska, in northern Maine. He had found the Lighthouse. The rest of the notes were practical. The work he'd done to the Lighthouse base room, the shelving he'd built and installed over the first summer, the foundation modifications that had extended the basement, the sealed passage connecting them. He'd documented the modifications the way an engineer documented a project, with notes on materials and methods, and the names of the contractors he'd hired from Portland, men who had no knowledge of what the work was for and who had been paid well enough not to ask. The last entry in his handwriting was dated May 1987, the same year as the county's condemnation order. He'd written, "The property tax will go delinquent from this year. I have arranged for the utilities to lapse on a delayed schedule. Whoever finds this place will find it in some condition of disrepair, which will reduce the likelihood of commercial interest." The contents of the tower and the basement extension are documented in the catalog following. I am placing this ledger with the documents in Box 3 because Box 3 is the most accessible from the entry point I have created. Entry point: the sealed wall in the basement. He'd known someone would eventually come through the wall. He'd placed the ledger in the most accessible box as a greeting. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about a man who had spent 20 years building a vault, who had cataloged it meticulously, who had understood that he would eventually not be there to explain it, and who had arranged for its discovery to be as logical and documented as possible. Not the actions of a criminal, the actions of someone who had thought about what came after. In the morning, Chester arrived at 7. She had coffee ready. The kids were still asleep. They went down together without discussing the order of things. Maya first, then Chester, both with flashlights, through the hole in the wall and into the low curved room. They stood on either side of the tarpaulin. In the combined light of 2 flashlights, the room looked different than it had in Maya's solitary visits, larger, somehow, the shelves less threatening and more simply present. Chester crouched and worked the rope that held the tarpaulin. The rope was stiff but not rotted, and the knots, though tightened by decades, came free with patient work. He rolled the canvas back from the near edge, and Maya held her light steady. What was under the tarpaulin was not a crate. It was a safe. A standing floor safe, roughly the dimensions of a small refrigerator, dark gray, the metal face showing a combination dial and two-handle locking mechanism. The manufacturer's plate on the upper corner reading Diebold, a company that had been making bank vaults since 1859 and had supplied safes to the United States Treasury. The face of the safe showed no damage, no attempted entry, no sign that anyone had touched it since Hargrove had placed it and covered it. In the center of the dial face, someone had taped a small envelope. The tape had yellowed and curled at the corners, but the envelope was still there, still attached, the flap sealed. Maya crouched in front of it. She peeled the tape gently, removed the envelope. On the front, in Hargrove's handwriting, the larger, more slanted script she'd learned from the ledger, were two words. For whoever. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. 3 lines. The combination is the year this lighthouse was built, followed by the year it was last attended by a keeper, followed by the year the federal government took the country off the gold standard. You know all 3 if you've read the catalog. What is in the safe is not in the catalog. I thought it better to leave some things for the person who finds this to discover for themselves. EJH. Maya read it twice. She looked at Chester. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between controlled astonishment and a kind of old sorrow. The expression of a man who had suspected something for 30 years and was now confronting confirmation. 1887, she said. He nodded. 1962. He nodded again. And 1933, she said. The year gold was confiscated. The year the double eagles were melted. The year they were supposed to be melted, he said. She turned to the safe, set her fingers on the dial. Breathed once, slow. She dialed. Right to 1887. Left to 1962. Right to 1933. She felt the mechanism move with each number, the tumblers dropping into position with a solidity that spoke of extraordinary engineering still functioning after 5 decades. On the 3rd number, she felt the lock give. She turned the handles. The door swung open. The interior of the safe was divided into 3 sections. The upper section held documents, a thick stack of them, bound with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity and lay across the papers like a dried vine. The middle section held trays. She pulled the first one out and held her flashlight above it. Coins, but different from anything else in the room. These were in individual holders, hard plastic capsules, each one sealed, each one containing a single coin. The holders were labeled in Hargrove's handwriting. She read the first label, 1794 flowing hair dollar. The second, 1804 bust dollar class 1. The third, 1822 half eagle, 1 of 3 known. She looked at Chester. These are, she said, and then stopped, because she didn't have the vocabulary yet, didn't have the numismatic knowledge to say what she was looking at in terms that conveyed the actual significance. Chester crouched beside her and looked at the tray. He was quiet for a moment. The 1804 bust dollar, he said. I've read about those. There are 15 known. Each one is worth somewhere between $2 and $4 million at auction. She looked at the tray. There were 6 holders in the first tray alone. She pulled the second tray. More holders. More labels. Dates that ran from the 1790s through the 1930s, the most significant years of American coinage, the rarest variants, the specimens that existed in single-digit quantities worldwide. She didn't know all the names. She didn't need to. The pattern was clear. Hargrove had spent 40 years acquiring the most valuable coins in American numismatic history and had put them in a safe in a lighthouse on the Oregon coast. She pulled the third tray. These were not American coins. These were older, some of them considerably older. Ancient gold coins, the kind she associated with museums. Roman, she thought, looking at the profiles and the Latin text on the faces. Some of them Greek. Some she couldn't identify at all. Chester sat back on his heels. He was a man who didn't reach for dramatic expressions. He sat back on his heels in the stone room with the flashlight in his hand and looked at the contents of the safe with the careful attention of someone taking a long, slow inventory. Margaret, he said finally. I'll call her this morning, Maya said. And the appraiser. She needs to get the appraiser here. Maya was still looking at the tray of ancient coins. She was thinking about the conversation she was going to have with Margaret Ito. She was thinking about the ledger in box 3 and the hundreds of boxes cataloged in it. She was thinking about what she knew and what she didn't know, and she was trying to assemble a number from the pieces: the 23 large crates, the 14 small ones, the trays of coins in the safe, the ancient currency from civilizations that had been gone for 2,000 years. The number kept being too large. She kept producing it and discarding it because it was too large to be real, and then producing it again because the inventory in front of her didn't leave room for a smaller number. She put the trays back. She closed the safe. She left the combination where it was, all 3 tumblers set, the door unlocked. Then she went through the hole in the wall and up through the trapdoor and stood in the kitchen of her lighthouse while Chester came up behind her, and she put both hands flat on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, breathing. Lily was at the table. She'd been drawing while they were down in the basement, Captain beside her, crayons arranged in size, order the way she arranged them when she was paying close attention to something other than the drawing. She looked up when Maya came through. "Did you open the big covered thing?" she asked. "Yes." "What was inside?" "Very old coins," Maya said. "That belonged to the man who owned this place before us." Lily considered this. "Are they ours now?" "Yes." "Are they worth a lot of money?" Maya looked at Chester. Chester was standing at the trapdoor with his hands at his sides, not offering anything. "We think so," Maya said. "We're getting someone to come look at them." Lily went back to her drawing. "Good," she said. "Captain said they would be." In the bedroom doorway, Dario appeared. He'd been reading the book still open in his hand, his thumb keeping the page. He looked at Maya's face, then at Chester's, running the same calculation she'd watched him run since August, measuring the angle of things. "How much?" he said. "A lot," Maya said. "I don't know exactly yet." He nodded once, went back to his room. She heard the mattress take his weight. She heard the pages turn, steady and unhurried, which was the sound of her son sitting with large information by doing something small. Above the stove, Lily's sign, "Our Kitchen." Through the window, the tower, rising into the gray October morning. She thought about the motel room in Coos Bay. About $380 and 8 more nights. About what the end of a list felt like and what it felt like to find something that hadn't been on any list. She picked up her phone and called Margaret Ito. "I need the appraiser," she said. "Today if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." Margaret asked a question. Maya looked at the window, at the tower beyond it. "Because I opened the safe," she said. "And I need someone who can tell me what a Roman aureus from the 1st century is worth, and why Edmund Hargrove had 30 of them." The silence on Margaret's end lasted long enough to be meaningful. "I'll get you someone today," she said. The appraiser's name was Paul Shen. He was 63, a professor emeritus of numismatics from the University of Oregon who had spent 30 years authenticating coins for the major auction houses, whose name Margaret had produced in 2 hours because Margaret Ito, when she set her mind to a task, moved like a tide. He drove down from Eugene that afternoon in a car that had nothing distinctive about it, and carried 2 large bags that turned out to contain magnification equipment, testing tools, reference volumes, and a laptop with the kind of software that cross-referenced coin specifications against auction databases. He met Maya at the cottage door. He did not comment on the hole in the basement wall. He did not comment on the room with the shelves. He did not ask questions that weren't relevant to the work. He moved through the space with the focused quiet of a man encountering something he had been professionally trained for and had never expected to actually see, and he began. He worked for 4 hours on the first afternoon. He took photographs of every box, every label, every piece he opened. He wore white cotton gloves and handled each specimen with a careful 2-finger grip, turning it under his magnification lens and then setting it on a white cloth and stepping back to photograph it again. He worked through the contents of the Diebold safe with the particular reverence of someone who had handled important things for a long time and understood that importance was not about the money. He tested coins with the small kit he carried, edge checks, weight measurements, specific gravity tests, and entered each result into his laptop, and then sat very still looking at what the database returned. She watched him at one point from the hole in the wall without announcing herself. He had pulled the first tray from the safe and was holding one of the 1794 flowing hair dollar specimens under his loupe, turning it 1 degree at a time, his face completely still. After a moment, he set it on the cloth and sat back on the basement floor with his hands in his lap and looked at the ceiling. She recognized that expression. It was the expression of someone confronting something that exceeded what they'd prepared themselves to find. She went back upstairs. Maya was in the cottage kitchen when he came up through the trapdoor at 7 in the evening. He sat down at the table. He set his laptop in front of him. He looked at her. "I need to tell you several things," he said, "and I need you to let me finish each one before you respond." She sat down across from him. The fire crackled behind her. "The 1933 double eagles in the small boxes are genuine," he said. 15 specimens in the first box I examined. I opened 6 of the 14 small boxes and found similar numbers in 5 of them. If the remaining 8 boxes contain comparable quantities, and if the catalog is accurate about the other shelves, you may have in excess of 120 double eagle specimens." Maya said nothing. "At current auction values," he said, "accounting for the premium that accrues to collection size and the additional premium attached to this particular story, because this will be a story, Ms. Torres, once it's known, a conservative estimate for the double eagles alone would be in the range of $800 million. That is a conservative estimate." She said nothing. The other gold coins, the pre-1933 American issues in the large crates, represent a collection of a scale and comprehensiveness that I have not seen assembled in one place outside of the Smithsonian. The ingots in the marked boxes are 400 troy-ounce standard bars, currently valued at approximately $800,000 each, and I counted what appears to be over 200 of them. The ancient coins in the safe are not yet fully identified but include specimens that, individually, would be considered world-class discoveries. There is one coin in the lower tray of the safe that I believe to be a Roman aureus from the mint of Julius Caesar, circa 46 BC. If it is genuine, and initial examination suggests it would be among the finest known examples in existence. He paused. "I can't give you a final number tonight. I can't give you a final number this week. A full appraisal of everything in that room will take months. But I can tell you," he stopped. He looked at his laptop and then back at her. "I can tell you that my preliminary estimate, based on what I have examined in 4 hours, is that the contents of the Point Morrow Lighthouse represent one of the largest privately assembled collections of rare coins and precious metals ever discovered. Likely the largest in American history." Maya looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the number she'd been producing and discarding all week because it seemed too large. The number she'd kept arriving at and walking away from because she didn't know how to hold it. $445 million. She hadn't said it aloud to anyone. She'd written it on a piece of paper at 2 in the morning and crossed it out 3 times and written it again. She'd been afraid of it because large numbers, in her experience, were what other people had and what she was measured against and found wanting. Large numbers were what the mortgage had been and what the medical debt was and what she owed to a life that had decided it was done extending her credit. She had spent $250 on this. Paul Shin was watching her. "Ms. Torres," he said quietly, "are you all right?" She looked up. Outside the kitchen window, the tower stood against the darkening October sky, its dark lantern room at the top containing the sealed Fresnel lens that had guided ships home for 50 years, the tower that Edmund Hargrove had bought for $4,000 in 1966 and filled over 20 years with everything he valued, and then walked away from or been taken from or simply stopped being present for in 1989, leaving it all in the dark, waiting for 35 years on a cliff above the Pacific Ocean. For whoever. "Yes," she said. She was. Paul Shun came back the next day, and the day after that, and for 4 days after those. He arrived each morning at 8 with his bags and his white gloves and his laptop, and he went through the trapdoor and through the hole in the wall, and he worked until the light failed or his eyes did, whichever came first. He photographed every specimen. He documented every box. He entered every figure into the database that cross-referenced auction results going back 40 years, and at the end of each day, he came up to the kitchen table and told Maya what he'd found, in the careful, specific language of a man who knew that imprecision in this work cost people real money. On the second day, he found, in one of the large crates, a collection of American silver dollars spanning every year from 1794 to 1935, a complete run, every date, every mint mark, most of them in what he described as exceptional condition for their age. A collection like that, he said, was the work of a lifetime. It was also worth, at auction, somewhere between $4 and $8 million on its own. He said this the way he said everything, without drama, as a fact that had no obligation to be impressive. Maya had started to appreciate this quality. Paulchen was the first person in this process who spoke about the money, as if the money were simply a descriptor like weight or height rather than a verdict on her life. On the third day, he opened the flat display cases. Each one held a single coin, mounted and labeled in Hargrove's hand, each one occupying its own case the way a painting occupied its own frame. The 1849 double eagle, the first one ever struck, a pattern coin, one of two known to exist. The 1913 Liberty head nickel, which had a story attached to it involving a Mint employee who struck 5 unauthorized coins in secret, 4 of which were currently accounted for in museums and private collections. Paulchen held this one under his loupe for a very long time without speaking. "There are 4 known," Maya said. "There were 4 known," Paulchen said. He set it down and looked at her. On the 4th day, he reached the ancient coins that took up the lower portion of the far shelf, the Roman and Greek gold that he'd mentioned on the first night. He worked through those with a reference volume the size of a dictionary opened beside him, cross-checking dates and mint marks and artistic details against catalog entries. Some of them he could not identify immediately and photographed for later consultation with specialists he knew in London and Rome. But several he could, and their individual values, logged in his database, produced a column of numbers that climbed steadily into the territory where commas multiplied. On the 4th afternoon, Maya brought him coffee through the hole in the wall. He was crouched over one of the ancient coins with his loupe, and she set the cup beside him, and he didn't look up, just said thank you without shifting his attention. She stayed for a few minutes, watching him work. There was something she found settling in the specificity of what he did, the way he treated each object as a thing with an exact history, not an amount, a thing with a story that happened to have a dollar figure attached to it, if you chose to look at it that way. She thought about Hargrove building those flat cases for each coin, labeling each one in his careful hand, protecting them. She thought he would have liked Paulchen. On the 5th day, he came up through the trapdoor at 4 in the afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and turned it to face Maya. The figure on the screen was preliminary. He'd typed the word 3 times in the document header, preliminary, and underlined it. And below it had written an explanation of what the appraisal process would require before any number could be considered final, and the time that process would take, and the specialists who would need to be engaged, and the auction house that he recommended for a sale of this scope. Below all of that was the number, $445 million. Conservative end of the preliminary range. The high end of his current estimate was $610 million, contingent on market conditions at time of sale, the outcome of the legal question around the double eagles, and the degree to which the story of the collection's discovery drove auction attention. These were the kinds of variables that added or subtracted tens of millions. Maya read the figure 3 times. She looked at Paulchen. She looked at the window. She looked at Lily's sign above the stove, the orange crayon letters, the backwards N. She had written $445 million on a piece of paper in the second night and crossed it out 3 times because it was too large to keep. It was still too large. It was also real. "The federal question," she said. "The double eagles. Margaret is managing it. From what I understand from her this morning, the government's position has moderated. They sent an inquiry through the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland, but the inquiry is, by her description, tentative rather than aggressive. Hargrove bought privately in the decades after the 1933 recall. The coins have been in private hands for 60 years or more. The legal precedent is not clean, but it is not unfavorable." He paused. "Margaret will want to talk to you today." Maya nodded. She looked at the number again. $445 million. The amount she'd paid for the Lighthouse, $250. The ratio between those two figures was the kind of ratio that didn't fit in ordinary thought. It was more like a number in a fable, in a story people told about things that happened to other people, not the kind of number that attached itself to a woman who had been sleeping on motel bedspreads in her coat 3 weeks ago. "Thank you," she said, "for the work, for being careful with it." Paulchen closed the laptop. He looked at her with the direct, considered expression of someone who had spent 30 years in the proximity of things people valued. "You should know," he said, "that in 30 years of this work, I have never seen a collection assembled with this level of intention. Whoever Hargrove was, he wasn't a hoarder. He wasn't simply accumulating. He was building something. He paused. Each case, each box, each specimen was selected with a specific purpose in mind. The double eagles are the most visible part of this, but the collection as a whole is a document, a record of American monetary history. The most significant coins from the most significant periods, preserved in conditions that suggest he understood they would outlast him by a very long time. He stood and picked up his bags. Whatever you decide to do with it, I hope some of it ends up somewhere people can see it. He left. Maya sat at the table for a long time, the kitchen quiet around her, the fire low. Word began getting out on a Tuesday. She hadn't told anyone beyond Margaret and Chester and Paul Shun, but Margaret had filed the legal documentation establishing the chain of title with the Coos County Courthouse, and county records in Oregon were public, and someone who worked at the courthouse knew someone who wrote for the Coos Bay World. And by Tuesday morning there was a paragraph in the online edition about a tax lien property on Point Morrow Road and a collection of unusual historical value discovered by the new owner. By Wednesday the paragraph had become an article. By Thursday the Associated Press had picked up the article. By Friday morning, Maya's phone had more missed calls than she could count, from numbers she didn't recognize, and 2 voicemails from television producers. She let almost all of them go to voicemail. She answered Margaret and Chester, and 2 calls she'd been expecting. The first was from Rachel. She was in the Lighthouse Tower when Rachel called. She'd finally gotten a locksmith out from Coos Bay to open the door from the cottage side, and she'd climbed the 112 interior steps for the first time, and she was standing in the lantern room at the top with the Fresnel lens turning slowly before her, enormous and faceted, a machine for making light out of nothing, the October ocean visible in every direction through the gallery glass, when her phone buzzed with Rachel's name. She answered. "I just read it," Rachel said. There was a quality in her voice that Maya had heard before, not in the context of anything happy. It was the voice her sister used when she was confronting the possibility that she had been wrong, not about small things, but about something significant, and the confrontation was physical, landing in the body before the mind could process it. "I know," Maya said. "Maya." Her sister's voice was unsteady. "I told you it was a mistake. I said it was desperation wearing the mask of a plan. I actually said that to you." "You said Dad said that." "You were quoting Dad." "I was agreeing with the quote." A pause. "I'm so sorry." Maya looked out at the ocean. From this height, the water was flat and immense, and the rocky shoal that the lighthouse had been built to mark was visible below the surface, dark and constant, the thing you needed the light to see. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "I do. You were holding on by your fingernails, and I told you the thing you were reaching for wasn't worth reaching for. You were trying to protect me. I was telling you what seemed rational." Rachel's voice tightened. "Greg has not said anything yet. He will say something when he processes this, and it will be the wrong thing, and I want you to know in advance that when he does, I'll..." "Rachel." "What?" "It doesn't matter about Greg." A silence stretched between them. It was a different kind of silence than the ones Maya had been getting from Rachel over the preceding 2 years, not the careful silence of a sister managing her husband's impatience, not the weighted silence of someone measuring generosity against obligation. Just the silence of 2 people sitting with something real. "I want to come see it," Rachel said. "The lighthouse. If that's okay." Maya looked at the lantern room around her, the glass and the brass and the lens that had been dark for 62 years. She thought about her sister's kitchen in Beaverton, the 3 weeks of the den, the thank you note she'd left on the counter. She thought about the way love between sisters sometimes required longer distances than love between strangers, because sisters knew where to aim. "Come in spring," she said, "when the light is running again. You can see it from the water." "You've changed," Rachel said. "I haven't. I'm just not afraid of the same things." After she hung up, she stood in the lantern room for another 20 minutes. The Fresnel lens had not been operational in 62 years and would require restoration work before it could run again. But it was intact, all the prisms present, the brass mounting sound, the clockwork mechanism below, it's salvageable. The lighthouse could be made to work. She had known this since the first morning she'd climbed the tower and seen the lens, but it was one of the things she'd put aside to be thought about later, one of the decisions that required more stability than she'd had. She had stability now, or she was about to. Her mother called that evening, which was the second call she'd been expecting. Diane Torres was 67, a retired school librarian from Medford who had spent 40 years telling children that what they were looking for was usually on the shelves if they looked in the right place. She called at 7 from her kitchen, the same kitchen she'd been calling from for 30 years, and when Maya answered, she could hear the evening news on in the background and knew that her mother had been watching it and had heard something that made her need to call. "I saw it on the television," her mother said. "I know. They had a picture of the lighthouse." "Yes. And they said," her mother stopped. Started again. "They said the collection could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They said you paid 250. "Yes." The silence on the line was not the silence of a person thinking. It was the silence of a person feeling something too large for words to be useful yet. "Your father," her mother said finally. Maya waited. He would have done the same thing. The same exact thing. He would have seen that listing and he would have bid on it, and everyone around him would have thought he'd lost his mind, and he would have been standing right where you're standing now. Her voice broke on the last word. Not grief, exactly. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as grief, but had a different quality, the feeling of recognizing someone you love in an action taken after they were gone to take it. "I know," Maya said. "He saved things, your father. He saved things other people had given up on. He believed things that seemed finished weren't always finished." "I know. You are so much like him." Her mother was crying now, quietly, the way people cried when the feeling was too specific to make noise about. "I'm so proud of you. I'm so sorry for all of it. The months of it. For not being able to help more. You couldn't have helped more. You were there. You called every Sunday. That's not the same as, it's not nothing, either." They talked for an hour. The longest call they'd had in 2 years. About Ernesto, about the things he'd fixed and the things he'd believed in. About the specific inheritance of a parent's character that a child carries without choosing to. About Lily and Dario, and what Maya was going to do next. About the lighthouse. "Are you going to keep it?" her mother asked. Maya looked out the cottage window at the tower in the dark. No light in the lantern room yet, but the possibility of light. "Yes," she said. "We're going to stay." The federal inquiry was the hardest week. 2 representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland came to Point Morrow Road on a Thursday. They were polite, they were professional, and their politeness and professionalism did not fully conceal the position underneath that the government's view of the 1933 Double Eagles was that they had never been legally in private hands, that the recall order had been comprehensive, and that coins struck but not officially circulated prior to the recall were federal property. Margaret met them at the cottage door. She had driven down from North Bend with 2 boxes of documents and a specific expression Maya had learned to read over the preceding weeks, the expression of someone who had prepared for this argument and was confident in her preparation. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Maya sat at the kitchen table and listened and said nothing, because Margaret had told her to say nothing, and Margaret was right. The argument was legal and historical and moved through territory Maya didn't have the training to navigate. What she could follow was the direction of it. The way the government's representatives moved from certainty to qualification as Margaret laid out the chain of private ownership, the decades of uncontested possession, the court precedents, and the specific circumstances of a man legally declared dead with no estate and no heirs. By the end of the 3rd hour, the conversation had shifted from the government's claim to a negotiation. Margaret's proposal, which she presented without drama, as though it were the obvious solution that a reasonable review of the facts would produce, was a donation. 12 specimens from the Double Eagle collection would be donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Numismatic Collection, where they would be displayed publicly and permanently attributed to the Point Morrow collection and to Edmund Hargrove. In exchange, the government would recognize Maya's clear title to the remaining collection in its entirety. The donation would carry a tax credit valued at the appraised worth of the donated coins. The representatives asked for 10 days to consult with their superiors. In 11 days, they came back. The answer was yes. Maya called Margaret after the confirmation came. 12 coins, she said. 12 coins, Margaret said. To the Smithsonian. They'll be seen by 3 million visitors a year. Edmund Hargrove's name will be on the label. She paused. He collected those coins for 60 years. I think he would prefer them to be seen. Maya thought about the man who had written "Spend them on something real." I think so too, she said. Paulshin had told her the story would be a story, and he was right about that. By the time the federal agreement was signed, there were journalists in Coos Bay, Two of them camped at the entrance to Point Morrow Road in rental cars with cameras and notebooks. There was a reporter from the New York Times who had been calling Margaret's office daily for a week. A television crew from Portland had filmed the exterior of the lighthouse from a boat offshore and broadcast the footage on the evening news. Maya did one interview. She chose the Coos Bay World, the local paper that had published the first paragraph, because local seemed right, because the story had started here and should be told here first. She sat at her kitchen table with the reporter, a woman about her own age named Jana Voss, who asked clear questions and wrote down the answers without editorializing. And she told the parts of the story she was willing to tell. She talked about the auction listing and the $250. She talked about the night she'd gone into the basement. She talked about Chester and Margaret and Paul Shun. She didn't talk about the motel room or the car in the parking lot in August or the months of it, because those parts of the story were hers and the kids, and not for a newspaper article, or not yet, or not in that way. When Jana asked her what she would do with the money, Maya gave the answer she'd been thinking about since Paul Shun had turned the laptop around. Pay what I owe, she said. Give my kids a real home. And figure out what Edmund Hargrove meant when he said to spend it on something real. Jana printed that. People read it. Maya received letters, actual handwritten letters, mailed to the address that was now public record from people who had found the quote and wanted to tell her things. Some of them were strangers with opinions about what real meant. Some of them were people and circumstances that were variations of what Maya's circumstances had been, not identical, but recognizable, the same weight in the chest, the same end-of-list sensation. She read every letter. She answered some. The legal process took 6 months from the date of the federal agreement to the date of the first auction. Margaret managed it with the same methodical competence she brought to everything: the clear title, the insurance, the auction house selection, the scheduling. Paul Shun coordinated the appraisal team that came in from New York and London to complete the documentation that his preliminary assessment had begun. They worked in the Lighthouse Tower base room for 3 weeks, and when they were done, the catalog Hargrove had kept in Box 3 had been converted into an official auction catalog of 412 pages with photographs of every piece. The first auction was in New York. Maya didn't go. She watched a live stream from the cottage kitchen with the kids and Chester and Margaret, and a woman from the Coos Bay World who had asked to be there and whom Maya had said yes to because Jana Voss had never once asked a question that felt like it was aimed at her damage. The Double Eagles sold first, collectively, to a consortium of collectors who had arranged their bid over 6 weeks of negotiation. The number at the close of that lot made Lily look at the screen and then at her mother and ask if that was real. Yes, Maya said. Dario watched the screen without expression, his face doing the calculation she'd watched it do all his life, the careful adding of columns. When the auction closed, not just the first lot, but the first session, the first of 3 planned sales spaced over 2 years, he looked at his mother. Are we okay now? He said. Not. Are we rich? Not. What does this mean? Are we okay? Maya reached over and put her hand on his shoulder. Yeah, buddy. We're okay. He nodded once, went back to watching the screen. But she felt the change in him, something in the shoulder beneath her hand. Some tension that had been present for so long she'd forgotten it had a different baseline, releasing slightly. Not all at once, but beginning. The medical debt was paid the following week. $14,200, and the accumulated interest that had grown around it like a ring around a tree. Maya wired the payment from a bank account that no longer made her afraid to open, and she sat for a long time after the confirmation arrived with the payment summary in front of her. Lily's ear surgery. The Thursday they'd gone in and the Friday they'd come home, and the prescription she'd filled for $280, and the payment plan she'd accepted without hesitation because Lily's hearing was not a line item. She paid the payment plan off too. Called to do it by phone. The woman on the other end said congratulations, which was an odd word for it, but Maya understood. It was the right word. She called Rachel and told her. Rachel cried. Maya let her. She enrolled the kids in school in Coos Bay. A proper enrollment with a real address, and both kids starting on a Monday with new backpacks, and Lily wearing the dress that was her favorite, and Dario with his engineering books already in his bag alongside the required reading. She drove them to school that first morning and walked them inside and filled in the forms at the front desk with a Coos Bay address on every line and a phone number that was just her phone number. Not a motel extension, not a temporary forwarding service. Just her number. just their address. The school secretary was a woman named Faye who had the brisk efficiency of someone who processed dozens of these enrollments a year and treated each one with exactly the same care. She looked at the forms, asked the standard questions, copied the documents Maya had brought. Then she looked up and looked at Lily specifically, who was standing at the counter in her favorite dress, holding Captain by one ear. "Is that a fox?" Faye asked. "He's Captain," Lily said. "He watches things." "He watches things," Faye repeated, as though this were the most reasonable answer she'd heard that morning. "Yes, he's good at it." Faye smiled. "Then he's welcome to watch things here." She handed the forms back to Maya. "We'll see them Monday." Maya parked outside the school afterward and sat in the car. She didn't go anywhere. She sat with both hands on the wheel in a parking lot at 9 in the morning on a Thursday in November and let herself feel the specific, unspectacular weight of something ordinary being restored. A school. A Monday start date. A secretary named Faye who had talked to Captain like it was normal. The forms with the real address. The forms that didn't require explanation or apology. She had been afraid, for 2 years, of exactly this moment, not the bad moments, which she'd known how to push through, but a moment this simple. A moment where things were just okay, and there was no emergency requiring her full attention, and the kids were starting school on Monday, and she could sit in a parking lot and let herself notice that she was still here, that they were all still here, that they had made it. She sat for a long time. Then she drove home to the Lighthouse. The medical debt was paid the following week. It came through Margaret's office, forwarded from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland, which had received it from a records firm in Philadelphia that had been administering a dormant estate file for 30 years. The file was Hargrove's. The estate had no cash, no investments, no property. Everything had been in the Lighthouse. And without the Lighthouse, the estate had contained nothing except a sealed envelope in a safe deposit box at a Philadelphia bank, instructed to be forwarded to the current owner of the Point Morrow property upon presentation of proof of title. Maya sat at the kitchen table and opened it. The letter was 6 pages, handwritten, in the larger slanted script she recognized from the catalog notes. Dated March 1989, 8 months before his disappearance, if disappearance was the right word for what had happened. She read it slowly, all 6 pages, and when she was done she put it down and looked at the ceiling and felt something she hadn't expected to feel for a man who had died before she was in high school. She read it a second time. He was a real person. She'd known this. Of course the ledger had shown her the practical man, the one who cataloged and planned and mortared walls with precision. But the letter showed the other parts. A man who had loved his wife for 11 years and had spent the next 35 measuring everything against the shape of her absence. A man who had grown up watching the world reorganize itself violently, the Depression, the war, the confiscations, the institutions that promised security and then revised their promises when security became inconvenient. A man who had responded to that watching by building something of his own, private and protected, and who had only at the very end understood that the things he'd protected and the life he'd failed to build were connected. He hadn't been a bad man. He'd been a careful one, in the wrong direction. Hargrove had been diagnosed with a progressive heart condition in 1988. The cardiologist in Portland had given him a year, maybe 18 months. He was 70 years old. He had been a widower for 35 years. He had no children. The collection in the Lighthouse was the work of his life, and the Lighthouse was the only place he'd ever lived that felt, as he wrote it, like somewhere that had been built for a specific purpose and was fulfilling it. He wrote, "I have decided not to die in a hospital. I will walk into the ocean on a day of my choosing, and the Pacific will take me in a way that seems appropriate for a man who spent his life on a cliff above it. I have made arrangements for my estate. The coins are in the Lighthouse. Whoever needs the Lighthouse most will find them." He wrote, "I collected things because I did not trust institutions to keep them safe. I spent my life believing that the world would fail, and I was not wrong about the world, but I was wrong about what that meant. It meant I should have been holding the things I valued closer, not the gold. The other things. The ones you can't put in a box." He wrote, "I have left a catalog. I have left a note in box 3. I have left everything else in the safe. Whoever finds this, spend it on something real. A house. Your children. A future that doesn't depend on what anyone else decides to do. I had the means to build that for myself, and I built a vault instead. Don't repeat that mistake." He wrote, in the last paragraph, On the last page, the lighthouse should work. The lens is intact. I checked it in October of last year. A lighthouse that doesn't work is just a tall stone room on a cliff. Make it work. Someone out on the water needs it. Maya read that last paragraph 3 times. She set the letter down. She looked at the tower through the window. The lantern room dark against the November sky. The Fresnel lens sealed inside it, waiting. She thought about the man who had checked it in October 1988, who had gone up those 112 steps knowing he wouldn't be going up them many more times, who had wanted to know the light was ready for whoever came next. She called the restoration contractor in Salem that evening. Chester was at the cottage the morning she gave the letter to the kids to read. She'd thought about this carefully, what to give them, when, how much of Hargrove to make real for them, and how much to keep abstract. She'd decided they deserved the actual man. The letter was the actual man. Dario read it at the kitchen table, cover to cover, without stopping. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the window. He walked into the ocean, he said. Yes. On purpose. He was dying already. He decided where. Dario was quiet for a moment. Was that brave? Maya thought about it. I think he was just very tired, she said. And he wanted to choose the ending. Dario nodded. He picked the letter up again and reread the last paragraph, the one about the lighthouse. He set it down. We're going to fix the light, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He looked satisfied, the way he looked when variables resolved into a known quantity. He went back to his breakfast. Lily read the letter more slowly. She moved her lips slightly on the hard words, Captain, beside her plate, her orange juice untouched, while she read. She read the last page twice. Then she looked at Maya. He was lonely, she said. Not. He was brave, or sad, or good, or bad. Lonely. 7-year-old moral taxonomy, direct and accurate. Yes, Maya said. I think he was. Lily looked at Captain. At least the house had us, she said. Chester, at the table, looked at his coffee cup. His expression had the quality of a man deciding whether to say something. He decided not to. Some things required the silence that understood them better than words did. The restoration contractor came in January. 2 men from Salem who had worked on 3 other historic lighthouse restorations on the Oregon coast, and who moved through the tower with the same methodical care Paul Shun had moved through the coin room, photographing, documenting, assessing before touching anything. The Fresnel lens needed cleaning and rebalancing. The clockwork mechanism needed new parts machined from the original specifications. The gallery glass needed resealing. The electrical system that had been installed in 1962 needed complete replacement. The work took 4 months. Maya was there for all of it, learning the vocabulary as she went: prisms and bullseyes and flash panels, the geometry of how a lens that weighed a ton could be made to rotate on a mercury float, the difference between a fixed light and an occulting light, and the specific maritime identity of the Point Morrow light, which the original 1887 specification described as a fixed white light of the 4th order, visible 12 miles at sea. In February, while the restoration was underway, the second auction session took place in New York. This time Maya went. Chester drove her to the airport. She flew alone. The kids were at school, at their real school, in their town, where Lily had a best friend named Sophia, and Dario had joined the robotics club, and both of them were, in the specific and undramatic way that children adapted to stability, simply getting on with their lives. She stayed 2 nights in a hotel near the auction house, a hotel that was nice in a way that would have been invisible to her before October, and which she now felt clearly, the particular ease of a place where everything worked without requiring attention. She sat on the bed the first night and called Dario to check on homework, and called Lily to hear about what Captain had observed from the windowsill that day, which was a heron on the cliff path, which was, Lily said, the first heron Captain had seen and which Captain had rated as significant. She sat in the auction room on the second day in a gray dress she'd bought in Coos Bay and watched 60 years of one man's careful accumulation find new homes in museums and private collections and institutions that would display them behind glass in rooms with controlled humidity and people walking past to look at them. Paul Shun was there. He sat beside her for part of the afternoon and answered the questions she asked about specific lots and the stories attached to them. He was a good explainer. He had the quality of people who love their subject deeply enough to make other people love it too, not through performance, just through the specificity of what he knew. At one point, the 1849 double eagle, the first one ever struck, the pattern coin, one of two known, came up. The bidding opened and climbed, the numbers moving in increments that seemed theatrical until you remembered they were real, and it closed at a figure that Maya calculated was roughly equal to what she'd spent in monthly expenses across the entire 2 years after Derek left. One coin, 1 year's desperation, weighed against a single object that a man had protected for 30 years in the dark on a cliff in Oregon. The auction house's gavel came down, and the room applauded. Not the theatrical applause of a crowd at a show, but the specific, concentrated applause of people who appreciated the rarity of what had just changed hands. Maya sat with her hands in her lap and thought about a man in a lighthouse who had owned this coin for 3 decades and never shown it to anyone, and about what that meant, and about whether that was a tragedy or simply a different kind of keeping faith. She thought about spending it on something real. She thought about the coin in a glass case in a museum, 3 million visitors a year walking past it, most of them not stopping, some stopping, a few stopping long enough to read the label. The label would say Point Morrow Collection. It would say Edmund H. Hargrove, 1918 to 1989. It would say something about the Lighthouse. She thought that was real. She thought Hargrove would have agreed, if he'd had the chance to agree to anything. She'd been thinking about what that meant since she'd read the letter in November. She'd been listing, the way she listed, the things that qualified. The medical debt was paid. The kids were in school. The lighthouse was being restored. She was buying the cottage from herself, a strange formulation. But the legal process required it. The transfer of the property into a trust structure Margaret had recommended that protected it from some of the complications that came with sudden wealth. She'd set up an education account for both children. Not a small one. The kind that meant Dario could study structural engineering anywhere in the country if he wanted, that meant Lily could become a veterinarian without the weight of loans making it a calculation rather than a choice. And she'd done one more thing. A thing that wasn't entirely rational and wasn't entirely practical, and which she'd thought about every day since she'd read Hargrove's letter, and which she'd finally done on a Tuesday morning in December without announcing it to anyone. She'd bought the woman named Patricia, the family services coordinator, who'd given her the list of resources that led to other lists of resources, who had spoken with consistent kindness through 2 conversations that had cost Maya more dignity than she'd let herself acknowledge at the time a gift. Not money. Patricia wouldn't have accepted money. Instead, Maya had called the shelter on Franklin Street and made a donation substantial enough to fund 3 new family rooms for the next decade. She'd asked that the rooms be named for no one, which the shelter director had found unusual but had accepted. She'd also called the Harborview Motor Inn. Room 7. The manager, a tired-voiced man named Gary, remembered the October booking. She told him she wanted to prepay 100 nights, to be held as a reserve for families in emergency circumstances referred by the County Family Services Office. Gary had gone quiet for a moment. "You were one of those families," he said. "Yes. I remember your kids," he said. "The little girl with the fox." "Yes." He'd accepted the payment. He'd made the arrangement with the county. He'd said thank you in the voice of a man who had never expected to have that kind of conversation and meant every word of it. Spending it on something real. She thought of other things. She was still making the list. The lighthouse light came on for the first time since 1962 on a Saturday evening in May. The restoration was complete. The clockwork mechanism turned smoothly for the first time in 6 decades. The mercury float level, the Fresnel lens rotating at its prescribed rate, the prisms catching the light from the bulb inside, and throwing it out across the water in the pattern the original keepers had calibrated in 1887. 12 nautical miles. Chester was there. Margaret was there. Paul Shun had driven down from Eugene, which surprised Maya until he said he'd wanted to see it. Jana Voss from the Coos Bay World was there with a camera. Lily and Dario stood on the headland as the light came on, and Lily made a sound that wasn't words exactly, but communicated more than words would have, and Dario watched the beam sweep across the water toward the horizon with the expression he used when something he'd understood theoretically became real in front of him. The light swept out and came back, out and back. The rhythm of it old and specific and unchanged from the rhythm that had guided ships past the shoal for 75 years before the Coast Guard automated it, and the lighthouse stopped being attended. Out in the harbor, Chester had told her, 2 fishing boats had radioed each other when the light first appeared. He'd heard it on the VHF radio he kept in his truck. One of them was a man named Earl who had fished the Point waters for 40 years and who came on the radio and said, in a voice that carried more than the words, that the light was on again at Point Morrow. The other man had said, about time. Then the channel had gone quiet. Maya stood on the headland with her hands in her pockets and watched the beam go out across the water. The evening was clear, the first warm evening of spring, the ocean moving in long, easy swells, the rocky shoal visible just below the surface in the afternoon light before the beam became necessary. She thought about Hargrove standing on this same headland, looking at this same water, in all the years he'd lived here. She thought about him deciding the lens was intact in October 1988, checking it one last time before whatever came next. She thought about the letter, the 6 careful pages, the man who had spent his life protecting things and understood at the end that he'd been protecting the wrong things. She thought about the note from the catalog, spend it on something real. She thought about room 7 at the Harborview Motor Inn. 14 across, 12 down, 168 ceiling tiles. The door that wouldn't stop shaking. Lily's voice from under the bedspread, small and certain, trusting that her mother was already moving. She was always already moving. Chester came to stand beside her. He looked at the light going out across the water, the beams steady and returning. The same light that had been here 137 years ago and had gone dark 62 years ago and was, without ceremony, working again. He would have liked to see this, Chester said. Which one? She said. Hargrove or the last keeper? Chester considered it. Both, he said. She thought about that. 2 men who had stood on this headland decades apart, and for entirely different reasons, one who had kept the light running, and one who had turned it off and built a vault in the darkness it left behind, and the particular strangeness of the thing she'd done, which was to buy the vault and restore the light, to undo Hargrove's decision without judgment, to give the lighthouse back to what it had been built for. Dario came to stand on her other side. He was 11 now. He'd grown 3 inches since October, which felt impossible, but was measurable against the door frame in the kitchen where Maya had made a mark in pencil the day they arrived, and a second mark in November and a third in March. He'd been doing additional math at home, beyond the school curriculum equations from the engineering textbooks Chester had given him, the ones about load and stress and the principles of structures that lasted. He understood things now at 11 that most people didn't reach until college, and he carried this knowledge with the same careful quietness he carried everything, not showing off, just knowing. He'd also been going to the harbor with Chester on Saturday mornings. Not fishing. Dario had no particular interest in fish, but Chester had been pointing things out over the months. How the dock pilings were spaced to distribute load, how the breakwater was positioned to redirect rather than absorb wave energy, how the lighthouse tower's tapered profile was a structural solution to the problem of building something tall in high winds. Dario took these lessons in with the same quiet attention he gave everything, and then went home and looked up the engineering principles behind them, and then the following Saturday asked Chester questions that surprised him. The beam rotates once every 4 seconds, Dario said. Yes. The original keepers had to wind the clockwork every 4 hours. That was the shift length. 4 hours. How do you know that? Chester told me. He found a log from the last keeper in the Historical Society archives. He watched the beam go out and come back. It must have been a strange job, winding the clock and keeping the light and watching the water for 4-hour stretches in the middle of the night. Lonely, probably. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. Or maybe it felt useful. You know something needs you to do a thing, and you do the thing, and the thing gets done, and someone who doesn't know you exist gets home safe because you did it. He shrugged slightly. That seems like enough. Maya looked at her son. 11 years old, 3 inches taller, the green eyes that were his mother's eyes seeing clearly in the failing light. Yeah, she said. That seems like enough. He was quiet again for a moment. He had the fisherman's patience with silence, which he'd learned from Chester without being taught, just absorbed. Mom, he said. Yeah. I want to build bridges. He said it the way he said things he'd decided were true, not as a question, not as an announcement, just as information being passed between 2 people who were paying attention. Like real ones. Big ones. The kind that let people get from one place to another who couldn't get there before. Maya looked at her son. I know, she said. Is that okay? She reached over and put her hand on his shoulder and kept it there. That's better than okay, she said. Lily appeared between them, captain under one arm, looking out at the light. She'd given the lighthouse a name. She'd announced it one morning at breakfast without preamble that she'd decided the lighthouse's name was Hazel, because hazel was the color of the water on certain days, and because it was a name that sounded patient, and the lighthouse had been patient for a long time. Maya had not argued. Chester had nodded, as if the name had been obvious all along. Hazel looks good, Lily said, watching the beam. She does, Maya said. She was waiting a long time. Yes. Lily leaned against Maya's side. Captain watched the ocean from his position under her arm. One glass, I turned toward the water, the same water he'd been watching from the windowsill since October when Lily had stationed him there on the first day. His job was still the ocean. He was still doing it. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her mother, from Medford. She answered. I'm watching the news, her mother said. They're showing the lighthouse. Your lighthouse. The light is on. Yes. It's on the television, Maya. It's beautiful. Maya looked at the tower. The lantern room bright against the darkening sky, the beam going out across the water in its old 4-second pattern. The stone walls that had stood since 1887 and would, if they were maintained, stand for another century after this one. The cottage with its cast iron stove and its 2 bedrooms and its sign above the kitchen that said our kitchen in orange crayon. She had framed the sign, had bought a simple frame in Coos Bay and hung it properly on the wall, and when Lily had asked why she'd done that, she'd said, because things that are true deserve to be kept. Yes, she said. It is. Your father would be standing there next to you, her mother said. If he could, he would be standing there, and he would be saying I told you so, in the kindest possible way. Maya laughed. Real laughter, the kind that came from somewhere below the throat. He absolutely would. Are you happy? She thought about what the word meant now. Not the happiness of things resolved. Because things were never fully resolved, there was still the list, still the questions about what came next, still the ongoing work of being 2 parents in one body and doing it well enough that the kids were okay, still the monthly calls with Patricia at the shelter, still the nights when she woke at 2 and lay in the dark and thought about the car in the parking lot, and the specific arithmetic of what almost happened. Happiness wasn't the absence of those things. It was the presence of this. The light on the water, her children on the headland. The cold coming in off the Pacific with its specific smell of kelp and distance. Chester and Margaret and Paul Shin, 3 people who had come to a cliff on the Oregon coast and stayed, each for their own reasons, all of them now somehow part of what the word home contained. The knowledge that she had $107 left after buying the lighthouse, and that she had spent it on candles and matches and flashlights, and that it had been exactly enough. Her mother was quiet for a moment. The news broadcast was audible in the background. Yes, she said. I'm happy. Reporter saying something about the restoration, about the history of the lighthouse, about what it meant to have the light working again after 62 years. You grabbed something, her mother said. In the dark, without knowing what it was. Yes. And it turned out to be a lighthouse. Lily came to her side and held up a stone. She'd found it on the path down to the cliff, smooth and gray and oval, worn by water into something close to perfect. She wanted to know if it was a keeper. Maya took it, felt the weight of it, turned it in her palm. It was the weight of something that had been slowly becoming itself for a very long time. Perfect, Maya said. She handed it back. Lily put it in her pocket, went back to watching the light. Captain was under her arm in his usual position, one eye on the ocean, doing his job. Maya looked at the tower one last time. The beam went out, came back, went out. 12 nautical miles into the dark. Someone out on the water was finding their way home because this light was on. She would never know who. She would never know how many, across the months and years to come. That was all right. That was how it was supposed to work. The lighthouse didn't need to know. It only needed to keep the light on. It turned out to be everything, she said. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.